He showed up at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and he wasn't supposed to be there. Calvin Rusk had a way of appearing in places he no longer had any right to be. Outside her apartment, outside the coffee shop she'd switched to twice, and now here, standing in the rain on Michigan Avenue with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes fixed on the revolving doors of Blackstone Meridian Tower like he owned the street and everything on it. He didn't knock, didn't call. He just stood there in the dark and the wet, patient the way predators are patient, waiting for Nia Calloway to walk out those doors alone. She almost did. If Seo Tae-jun hadn't forgotten a contract on his desk, she would have. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because stories like this one don't come around every week. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that night, because what happened inside that building changed two lives in ways neither of them saw coming. Check. The executive floor of Blackstone Meridian Tower at nearly midnight was the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Not peaceful quiet. The quiet of a place that had been loud all day and hadn't quite let go of it yet. Paper still faintly warm from the printer. Coffee cups rinsed but not put away. The particular stillness of fluorescent lights left on in empty rooms. Seo Tae-jun moved through it the way he moved through most things. Efficiently. Without announcing himself. He was 34 years old and had spent the better part of a decade learning how to walk into rooms without giving people time to prepare. In the world he operated in, the one behind the legitimate boardrooms and the quarterly earnings reports and the charitable foundations, preparation was what got you killed. Or worse, outmaneuvered. Tae-jun had built Blackstone Meridian Holdings into something real. Logistics, real estate, private security, a portfolio of subsidiary businesses that collectively employed over 3,000 people across 6 states. It looked clean from the outside. It mostly was clean from the outside. The part that wasn't ran deeper, and Tae-jun had learned to keep those two worlds from touching each other the way you learn to keep a lit match away from gasoline. Carefully. Constantly. Without ever letting yourself believe the danger had passed. He was thinking about the contract, the Weller Group acquisition draft that his attorney had revised twice and that Tae-jun had left on his desk because he'd been in back-to-back calls for 6 hours, and his brain had finally started making small, uncharacteristic errors. He needed to review it tonight, so the morning meeting didn't collapse. That was the only reason he came back. That was the only reason he heard her. The sound reached him before he turned the corner. Not loud, not dramatic, just the particular broken rhythm of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Short exhales. A swallowed sound. The kind of crying that has been practiced into something almost manageable. Tae-jun stopped. In his world, unexpected sounds in empty buildings meant one of 3 things, none of them good. His hand moved on instinct, not toward a weapon he wasn't carrying tonight, but toward his phone. His body angled itself the way it always did when something unscheduled entered his field of awareness. Then he turned the corner and saw the lamp. One desk lamp burning at the far end of the executive suite, throwing a small warm circle of light over a figure he recognized immediately. Nia Calloway sat with both hands pressed flat against her face, her phone lying face up on the desk beside her, screen flashing with incoming calls that she was letting go to voicemail one after another. Her shoulders were drawn up tight. Her whole body had the look of something compressed, something that had been holding a shape for too long and was finally, in the privacy of an office she believed was empty, allowing itself to come apart just slightly. Tae-jun had known Nia Calloway for 18 months. In 18 months, he had never seen her cry. He had seen her manage a scheduling crisis involving 3 continents and a collapsed interpreter service without raising her voice. He had seen her absorb a 40-minute phone call from the most difficult attorney in Chicago and emerge from it with 2 pages of usable notes and an expression of professional calm so complete it bordered on unsettling. He had watched her navigate the operational chaos of his organization, the legitimate half, the half she knew about, with a competence that made people who had worked there for years quietly embarrassed by comparison. She was 27. She had the kind of intelligence that didn't need to announce itself. And she had, in 18 months, never once made her problems anyone else's problem. The phone flashed again. Same name, over and over. Tae-jun caught the name on the screen from across the room without meaning to. Calvin Rusk. He almost spoke. The word almost formed, her name, just her name, but something in the way she was sitting stopped him. She hadn't heard him come in. She had a few more seconds of privacy, and something in the shape of her told him she needed those seconds badly. He stepped back. He took the contract from his desk by memory in the dark, didn't turn on a single light, and left the floor the same way he'd arrived, quietly, without announcing himself. He stood in the elevator going down and looked at the contract without reading it. He thought about the sound she'd been making. The next morning, Nia arrived at 7:53, which was her standard. Coffee already going, 2 calls managed before 8 o'clock, the morning briefing packet on his desk before he'd taken off his coat. She greeted him with the same focused warmth she brought every day. Not performance exactly, but professional, contained, the particular manner of someone who understood that her job was partly to make other people's environments function smoothly and had decided to do that job without complaint. "Good morning, Mr. Seo." "Morning." She looked fine, that was the word for it. Not good, not rested, not genuinely at ease. Fine. The specific presentation of fine that takes real effort to maintain and that most people accept without looking past. Tae-jun accepted it, for one day. On the second day, he started watching. Not in a way anyone would notice. Tae-jun was practiced at watching without appearing to watch. It was part of the same skill set that had kept him alive and out of federal courtrooms for 10 years. He watched the way Nia moved through the office, the way she tracked the elevator doors each time they opened, the way her shoulders didn't fully drop until she'd accounted for who was in the room. She ate lunch at her desk. Again. She had done this, he realized, almost every day he could remember. He had assumed it was work ethic. He was beginning to revise that assumption. Her phone rang just after 2 in the afternoon. The name on the screen, he caught it again, same name, Calvin Rusk, made her go very still for exactly 3 seconds before she declined the call and kept typing as though nothing had happened. Her hands, Tae-jun noticed, took slightly longer than 3 seconds to steady. He called Min Jae-kwon that evening. Min Jae was 41, former military intelligence, and had been Tae-jun's security chief for 6 years. He was a man of very few words and extremely precise action, which was exactly what the position required. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. When Tae-jun gave him a name and asked for a discreet look at the situation, Min Jae simply said he'd have something in 48 hours and ended the call. He had something in 36. The report was 3 pages. Tae-jun read it twice. Calvin Rusk, 33 years old, no criminal record, currently employed as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. Nothing in the public record that would explain the locked expression on Nia's face when his name appeared. But Min Jae didn't deal in public records alone. The gray sedan had been sitting across the street from Blackstone Meridian Tower for 11 days. Security footage from a neighboring building. Min Jae had contacts. He always had contacts. Showed Calvin Rusk inside that sedan for hours at a stretch, watching the entrance. 3 times in the past 2 weeks, he had approached Nia on the sidewalk when she left the building. Each time, she had either turned back inside or changed direction. Each time, Calvin had followed for half a block before stopping. He hadn't touched her, hadn't made any visible threat. He had simply appeared, repeatedly and persistently, in places she was. Tae-jun closed the report and sat with it. He had learned in his particular career to be careful about the space between what he saw and what he assumed. The space between those two things was where mistakes were made. Calvin Rusk could be a man with an explanation. A friend Nia was avoiding for personal reasons that were none of Tae-jun's business. A former partner whose intentions were innocent even if his methods were poor. That was possible. But Tae-jun also knew what fear looked like on a person who was trying very hard to keep it hidden. And the woman who had sat alone in the dark, pressing her hands over her face while a phone rang and rang with the same name over and over, did not look like someone avoiding a conversation she found inconvenient. She looked like someone trying to survive one. He authorized a quiet expansion of lobby security and said nothing else for 3 days. On the 4th day, he found her standing at the window of the small break room on the executive floor, her back to the room, her arms crossed over her chest, looking out at the city below with the expression of someone who had gone somewhere far away in their own head and wasn't sure how to come back. She didn't hear him come in, again. "You didn't eat lunch today," he said. She turned fast. The expression shifted, that quick professional reset, that practiced arrangement of composed features. And then something slipped, just slightly, before it locked back into place. I wasn't hungry. You weren't hungry yesterday either. A beat. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite surprise, but was somewhere in between. I'm fine, Mr. Seo. I know you keep saying that. The words came out flatter than he intended, more direct. Nia looked at him for a moment, and he could see her deciding, calculating, the way intelligent people calculate when someone has gotten closer to something they're guarding than they intended to allow. Is there something you need from me? No, he said. There isn't. He poured himself a coffee he didn't particularly want and left her with the city and whatever she'd been thinking about. That evening, reviewing security footage with Min-jae on a private monitor, Tae-jun watched Calvin Rusk park the gray sedan at 6:45, 40 minutes after Nia's scheduled end of day. She had stayed late. She had stayed late on Tuesday and Thursday of the previous week as well. The pattern assembled itself in his mind without much effort, because the pattern wasn't complicated. She was staying in the building until she believed he was gone. She was timing her exits around his surveillance schedule, which meant she had noticed the schedule, which meant she had been paying very close attention. Nia Calloway was not working late because she was dedicated. She was working late because she was afraid to go home. Tae-jun reached for his phone, then stopped himself. He wanted to call Min-jae and give an instruction that would resolve the situation in the way his world typically resolved situations, directly, decisively, and without the extended suffering of people he considered under his protection. He had that capability. He used it rarely and selectively, and he told himself the line between the two versions of his life was one he controlled. But Nia wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person in a situation she hadn't asked for, and somewhere between the first night and this one, Tae-jun had stopped thinking about her in terms of what disruption her situation might create for his organization. I was thinking about her hands, the way they had taken longer than 3 seconds to steady after she declined that call. He had the gray sedan's plates run through channels that weren't connected to anything official, and then he sat in his office in the empty building until nearly 10 o'clock, turning the report over in his mind, not yet certain what the right move was, and uncomfortably aware that the uncertainty was something he didn't often feel. 2 floors below, in the parking structure, a car belonging to his security team idled quietly near the exit Nia always used. She didn't know it was there. He hadn't told her. He wasn't sure yet if telling her would help or only make the walls go back up faster. The following morning, he arrived early, earlier than usual, which was saying something. And when Nia walked in at 7:53 and found him already at his desk, the small flicker of surprise on her face told him she'd been counting on having the floor to herself for a few minutes first. He didn't address it. He let her settle. Let her make the coffee and start the calls and produce the morning briefing with the same competence she brought every single day. And then when the floor was full and the workday was moving, he stopped by her desk with a question about a scheduling conflict that didn't genuinely require her input, and while she was pulling up the calendar, he watched her hands. Steady. She was okay when she was working. When she had something to do with her hands and her mind and the particular engine of her capability was running, she was okay. It was the pauses that cost her. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Just before 5 that afternoon, his direct line rang. Min-jae. 2 words. He's back. Tae-jun was at the window in 4 seconds. The gray sedan sat exactly where it always sat, across the street, slightly west of the entrance, positioned to see the revolving doors clearly. Calvin Rusk had learned Nia's schedule well enough to know when to show up. He had been doing this for weeks before Tae-jun had known to look. How long before that had it been happening? How long had she been timing her exits around a man in a gray car across the street, alone, without telling a single person? Tae-jun pressed his knuckle briefly against his teeth, a habit he'd never entirely broken, a tell his security team had long since learned meant he was holding something back that wanted out. And then he made 2 calls. The first was to the building's head of security, with instructions about the underground garage access and a cover story about general protocol updates. The second was to his driver, Daisu, who was told to park below and remain available until further notice. He went back to his desk and finished the afternoon. And at 6:15, when Nia finally shut down her computer and reached for her coat, with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had been monitoring the time without appearing to monitor it. Tae-jun looked up. "Take the garage exit tonight," he said, without inflection. "Renovation crew's been using the front sidewalk after 6. Easier below." There was no renovation crew. Nia looked at him for a beat. Then she looked out the window at the darkening street below, and he watched something move across her face. Relief, and something rawer beneath it. Something that looked uncomfortably close to the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long they've forgotten what it felt like to have anyone notice the weight. "Okay," she said. Just that. She took the garage exit. Dae-soo was waiting, and in the gray sedan across the street, Calvin Rusk sat until 8 o'clock, watching doors that didn't open, before finally driving away into the November dark. Dae-soo didn't ask questions. That was one of the things Tae-jun valued most about the man. 38 years old, built like a refrigerator someone had taught to drive, and possessed of a professional discretion that made him more valuable than half the people on Tae-jun's executive payroll. He drove Nia to her apartment building on West Huron without comment, without small talk, without the particular brand of forced friendliness that would have made the silence between them awkward instead of simply quiet. Nia sat in the back seat and looked out the window. She didn't ask why there was suddenly a car available for her. She didn't ask about the garage access, or the changed exit route, or why any of it had appeared in her life on this specific evening without explanation. She sat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it, and watched Chicago move past the glass, and the only indication that she understood exactly what was happening, that someone had noticed, that someone had arranged things without making her ask, was the way her shoulders sat slightly lower than they had all day. Not relaxed, not relieved, just less compressed, like something had released 1 degree of pressure from a container that had been building for a very long time. Dae-soo pulled up to her building. She thanked him. Brief, genuine, no extra words. She got out and walked to the entrance without hurrying, which told Tae-jun, watching the building's exterior camera feed from his phone 3 miles away, that she felt marginally safer than she had in weeks. She punched in the door code. She went inside. The light in her third-floor apartment came on 4 minutes later. Tae-jun put his phone down and looked at the city through his office window for a long time before going home himself. He told himself it was due diligence, protection of a key employee. The same calculation any responsible organization would make when a staff member's personal situation created a potential security variable. He told himself that clearly and without hesitation, and almost believed it. Almost. Minji called at 7 the next morning before Tae-jun had finished his first coffee. He went to her building last night, after he left Michigan Avenue, sat outside for 40 minutes. Tae-jun set the coffee down. Lobby camera? Didn't go in, just sat in the car. Same car. Same car. There was a pause on the line that neither of them filled, because both of them understood what it meant without needing to say it. Calvin Rusk wasn't operating on impulse. He wasn't showing up because he missed someone and made a bad decision on a particular evening. He was running a pattern. Office, apartment, office. He had her geography memorized, and he was using it methodically. "I want eyes on the building," Tae-jun said. "Already arranged." He ended the call and finished the coffee cold. Nia arrived at 7:53. She looked like she had slept, which was something. Her eyes were clear and her movements had their usual precision, and she came in carrying a paper bag that turned out to contain breakfast pastries she left in the break room for the floor staff. A small thing she did occasionally, without announcement, that Tae-jun had noticed and never commented on, because commenting on it would have made it into something larger than she intended it to be. He watched her settle in and start the morning and told himself for the 4th time that he was going to leave this alone. He lasted until 11:30. She was on the phone with the legal team about a vendor contract when he passed her desk on his way to the conference room. Not the content of the call. He wasn't listening to that. But the particular flatness in her voice, the way she was moving through the conversation on something like autopilot, while the rest of her attention was somewhere else entirely. Her free hand, resting on the desk beside the keyboard, had 3 fingers pressed down against the surface like she was checking to make sure it was still solid. He kept walking. The conference room meeting ran 2 hours and covered nothing that required his full attention, which meant his full attention kept sliding sideways to things that did. When it ended, he came back to find her desk empty. Lunch, presumably. and he sat in his office with the door cracked and looked at the framed photograph on the credenza behind his desk. His father. A man who had taught him that power expressed itself in control, and that control was the only currency that didn't devalue. His father had not been a soft man. Tae-jun had not considered himself a soft man either. He was beginning to suspect this situation was going to complicate that self-assessment. Nia came back from lunch at 12:48. She'd eaten, or he assumed she had, though the particular careful blankness of her expression when she sat back down and pulled up her work suggested she'd spent at least part of the lunch hour somewhere other than a restaurant. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen. The color in her face did something he could only describe as retreating, draining back from the surface the way water pulls back before a wave. And then she declined the call and placed the phone face down on the desk and stared at her monitor for a full 4 seconds without touching the keyboard. Tae-jun stood up. He crossed to her desk before he'd made a conscious decision to do it, which was unusual for him. Conscious decision preceded action in his experience. That was how you stayed alive and free. "Walk with me," he said. She looked up. "I'm in the middle of—" "It'll hold." She read his face for a moment with the particular sharp attention she brought to everything, and whatever she found there made her push her chair back and stand up. They took the stairs to the small rooftop terrace that nobody used in November except Tae-jun, who came up here occasionally when he needed to think without walls around him. The wind off the lake cut through immediately. Nia pulled her blazer tighter without saying anything about the cold. He let the silence sit for a moment. Let the city do its thing below them. The noise and the distance and the scale of it, which had a way of making certain conversations feel slightly less impossible. "How long?" he said. She looked at him sideways. "How long what?" "Has he been showing up?" The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone who has been caught and is calculating how much ground to give. "I don't know what you're—" "Nia." Just her name. No inflection. No pressure. Just her name placed in the space between them where the deflection had been. Her jaw tightened. She looked out at the skyline and breathed. One breath. Deliberate. The kind you take when you need to get something under control before it gets out of your mouth in the wrong shape. "A few months," she said. "A few months is not a specific number." 4. A beat. Maybe closer to 5. 5 months. He had known her for 18. For 5 of those 18 months, she had been timing her exits around a man in a gray car, eating lunch at her desk because restaurants had too many exits to monitor, staying late in an empty building because late in an empty building was safer than the street. For 5 months. And in 5 months she had not said one word to anyone, had not let one crack show in the professional surface she maintained every single day. Tae-jun looked at the side of her face. She was holding herself very still. "Why didn't you say anything?" The question came out more direct than he planned. She heard it and something moved across her expression. Not defensiveness exactly, but something close to it. Something older than defensiveness. "Because it's my problem. It's become a security matter for this building." "I know." Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone gripping something tightly, not of someone who was actually calm. "That's why I drafted the resignation." He had forgotten about the resignation. Or rather, he had set it aside and not fully reckoned with it. The fact that she had prepared it, that she had framed leaving as the solution, that her first instinct had been to remove herself from a situation she hadn't created. "You're not resigning," he said. "You can't decide that." "I already decided it when I didn't accept the letter. I can submit it to HR directly." "You can." He turned to face her more squarely. "And I'll still reject it." She stared at him. The wind pulled a strand of hair across her face and she pushed it back with one irritated motion, which was the most genuinely unguarded thing he had seen her do in 5 months. "You don't get to do this," she said. "Do what? Make decisions about my situation without asking me what I want." The words landed with more weight than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as much weight as she intended, because she held his gaze after she said them and didn't look away or qualify or soften it. He took that, sat with it for a second. "What do you want?" he said. The directness of the question seemed to catch her off guard, which was not something that happened to Nia Calloway easily. She looked at him like she was waiting for the follow-up clause, the qualifier, the but that would reveal the question as rhetorical. There wasn't one. "I want it to stop," she said finally. Her voice had dropped slightly, not to a whisper, but to the register that meant she was saying something real, something that hadn't been processed through the professional filter first. I want to walk out of a building without checking who's across the street. I want to answer my phone without looking at the name first. I want to... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I want to stop feeling like I did something wrong. The last sentence was the one that cost her something. He could see it in the way she pulled back slightly after saying it, the automatic flinch of someone who had revealed more than they planned to. Tae-jun said nothing for a moment, then, "You didn't do something wrong." "I know that." Sharp, immediate. "Intellectually, I know that. But..." She laughed, a short, humorless exhalation that wasn't really a laugh at all. "But I trusted him. For 4 years. I thought I was a good judge of people." She shook her head. "I'm very good at my job, Mr. Seo. I notice things. I pay attention. And I still didn't see it coming until I was already in the middle of it." A pause. That's the part that's hard to get past. He understood that in a way he didn't particularly want to examine. The particular humiliation of having been outmaneuvered by something you thought you were equipped to see. He understood it from a very different context, but the structure of the feeling was the same. "What started it?" he said. "When did you know something was wrong?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "He went through my phone," she said. "About 2 years in. I came home and he was sitting at my kitchen table with my phone in his hand. And when I walked in, he wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He just looked at me and said, 'Who is Marcus?'" She paused. "Marcus was a colleague, someone I worked with. That was all. But Calvin wanted every text, every call. Why I'd talked to him, what we'd talked about, whether anything had happened. And you explained." "I explained." Her voice was very even. "And he apologized, and he said he was sorry, and he said it came from love, from fear of losing me, and I believed him. And 6 weeks later he had the password to my email." She turned and looked at the street below. "And 6 weeks after that he was calling my friends to ask if I'd mentioned anyone new. And by the time I understood what I was in the middle of, I had already spent 2 years building a life around someone who thought he owned it." The wind moved between them. Somewhere below, a truck horn sounded twice. "When did you leave?" 14 months ago." 14 months. She had been gone from that relationship for 14 months and he was still there, still parked across the street, still calling, still following the schedule of her day with the patient, organized attention of someone who had decided that her decision to leave was a temporary position rather than a permanent fact. "Has he ever..." Tae-jun stopped, chose the word carefully. "Has he touched you?" Nia looked at him. "Once," she said. "When I told him I was leaving, he grabbed my arm." She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something that has been stored for a long time in a place past the point of immediate pain. "I pulled away. He let go. He cried afterward and told me he'd never do it again." She looked back at the skyline. "I was already gone." The grab, the crying, the promise. Tae-jun had heard that sequence before, from different people in different circumstances, and it never varied much. The violence of it was precisely in how ordinary it was, how easily it could be minimized, framed as an exception, buried under subsequent gentleness. He wanted to put his fist through something. He didn't. "I'll need you to give Min-jae a full account," he said. "Every incident, every message, every time he's appeared. Dates, if you have them." She stiffened. "I'm not going to..." "It's documentation, nothing more. Whatever you decide to do with it is your decision." She looked at him carefully, weighing, the particular calculation of someone who has learned to be very careful about who they hand information to and what those people will do with it. "You're not going to do anything without telling me first," she said. It wasn't a question. "No. I need that to be a real answer, not a polite one." "It's a real answer." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once and looked back at the city. They stood there for another minute without talking. The wind kept coming off the lake. Below them, Chicago moved in its loud, indifferent way, 11 stories of building and glass between them and the street, which was the closest thing to safe that either of them could manage right now. "I should get back," she said. "Yeah." She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the handle. "Mr. Seo." She didn't turn around. "Thank you for the car last night." She went inside. He stayed on the terrace for another 10 minutes, looking at the intersection where the gray sedan liked to park, and letting the cold do what the cold does to things you're trying to think clearly about. The account she gave Min-jae ran to 40 minutes and covered 11 months of documented incidents. She'd been keeping notes in a private file on a personal device, dates and times and descriptions, because some part of her had understood early that she might need them. Min-jae listened without expression and asked questions that were specific and useful and entirely without judgment. And when it was done, he looked at Tae-jun across the desk and said 2 words. "It's worse." The additional surveillance footage Min-jae had pulled showed Calvin at locations Nia hadn't mentioned because she hadn't known about them. A coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, a dry cleaner she used once a month, the parking structure of her gym. He wasn't just following her to and from work. He had mapped the periphery of her life with the thoroughness of someone who had decided that thoroughness was the only strategy left to him. The messages Min-jae had managed to recover through indirect means, Tae-jun chose not to examine the methodology too closely, numbered in the hundreds over the past year. Most were calibrated to land just below the threshold of explicit threat. "Missing you. I know you're angry. I just need 10 minutes to explain. I don't understand why you're doing this. You know I would never hurt you." They were the messages of a man who had a very specific understanding of what he could say and what he couldn't, which was its own kind of statement. "He's not impulsive," Min-jae said. "No. That makes him more difficult." "I know." The organized patient version of this problem was harder to manage than the explosive version. The explosive version made clear decisions easy. This version required a different kind of thinking, and Tae-jun was doing that thinking carefully, aware that every instinct his professional life had given him was pulling toward a solution that would be fast and permanent, and would, with certainty, destroy the one thing that had started to matter in this situation: Nia's right to have the ending be hers. He had men who could handle Calvin Rusk in an afternoon. He had resources that would make a man simply cease to be a problem without leaving a visible thread connecting the resolution to Tae-jun's door. He had used those resources before, in circumstances that he had judged necessary, and he had not lost sleep over them. He sat in his office at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night and thought about how easily he could make this go away. And then he thought about what Nia had said on the rooftop. "You don't get to make decisions about my situation without asking me what I want." He put the thought down. He authorized legal counsel instead, a firm his organization used for sensitive matters, people who understood discretion and who were very good at constructing the kind of documented case that formal processes required. He told them to begin reviewing the material Min-jae had compiled and to prepare an assessment of available legal remedies without filing anything yet. He called Min-jae and told him to keep the apartment under watch and the garage access active and the driver available every evening until further notice. He did not call the men who could handle Calvin Rusk in an afternoon. He went home at 10 and slept badly and was back in the office by 6:45. The next 3 weeks moved in a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy from the outside. Nia worked. The floor ran the way it always ran. Meetings happened, deals moved, the operational machine of Blackstone Meridian did what it did. Tae-jun went about his days with the practiced composure of a man who had learned long ago to keep his interior weather from showing on his exterior surface. But things were different between them now, in ways neither of them acknowledged directly. She met his eye differently. Not with more warmth, exactly, that wasn't quite the word, but with less guard. The fraction of professional distance she had always maintained was still there, still appropriate, but the particular flatness that had lived behind it, the flatness of someone performing normalcy for an audience, had shifted. She still ate lunch at her desk, but twice that week she ate it while she was going over documents with Tae-jun at the small conference table beside his office rather than alone at her own station, and neither of them commented on the change in arrangement because making it a thing would have made it into something she'd have to think about. He bought better coffee for the executive floor. Nothing announced. It simply appeared. She gave him a look when she noticed. He pretended he hadn't heard the unasked question. She let it go. The sedan disappeared for 9 days. Min-jae reported it with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who understood the pattern but didn't want to imply optimism. He didn't feel. Tae-jun didn't lower any of the security arrangements. The car's absence didn't change the underlying situation. It only meant Calvin was adjusting his approach, An adjustment implied continued intent. He was right. On the 10th day, the sedan was back. This time, it was parked differently, further east, in a spot with a less direct sightline to the entrance, which meant he'd noticed something had changed and was repositioning. He was paying attention. He was adapting. Min-jae updated the surveillance coverage without being asked. Nia didn't know the sedan had returned. Tae-jun made a deliberate decision not to tell her that day because she had a major presentation to the board in the afternoon, and she needed to walk into that room with everything she had. He would tell her afterward. She walked out of the board presentation at 4:15 with color in her face and a quality of aliveness that the past few weeks had compressed out of her. The board had approved the operational restructuring she'd been building the case for over 2 months, and whoever was responsible for that outcome, and it was her, entirely hers, she was allowing herself to register it. She came back to the floor and sat at her desk, and for approximately 40 seconds, she did nothing. No keyboard, no phone. Just sat there and breathed and looked at the middle distance with something that was close to, though not quite, a smile. Then she looked up and found Tae-jun watching from his office doorway. "They approved it," she said. "I heard." She nodded, turned back to her screen. He crossed to her desk and set a folded piece of paper next to her keyboard. She picked it up, opened it. It was her resignation letter, unsigned. "I thought about accepting it," he said, "for about 3 seconds." She stared at the letter. "Put it wherever you put things you don't need anymore," he said, and went back to his office. There was a silence behind him. Then, quietly, he heard the sound of paper being folded again. He sat down at his desk and kept his eyes on his screen and felt something that took him a moment to identify, because it had been a while. He felt something close to steady. It lasted until 6:18 p.m. when Min-jae appeared in his doorway without knocking, which he never did unless the situation didn't allow for knocking, and said 4 words. "He's in the building." Tae-jun was on his feet before the 4th word finished. "Where?" "Parking structure. Level 2. Used a contractor credential. One of the subcontractors from the HVAC renovation on 7. We don't know how he got it." Level 2 of the parking structure was the level Nia used every evening when Dae-soo picked her up. Calvin had been watching long enough and carefully enough to identify the changed exit route. He had found a way inside. Tae-jun moved. He took the stairs, not the elevator, faster, and he needed fast right now. Min-jae was 2 steps behind him and had already radioed the 2 security personnel positioned on level 2. As they cleared the stairwell door into the parking structure, Tae-jun caught the smell of exhaust and concrete and fluorescent cold, and his eyes adjusted fast to the lower light. Calvin Rusk was standing near the elevator bank, hands in his coat pockets, watching the elevator indicator above the door with the patience of someone who had decided he would wait as long as he needed to. He was lean, dark-haired, clean-cut, in the manner of a man who understood presentation. He didn't look dangerous in the way people expect danger to look. He looked like a person waiting for someone they knew. That was the most dangerous version of this. Tae-jun didn't run. He walked, deliberate, controlled, the particular pace of a man who has already assessed the room and found nothing in it that concerns him. 2 security personnel materialized from separate positions as he crossed the structure. Calvin heard them and turned, and when he saw Tae-jun, something moved across his face. Recognition, calculation, and then a practiced recomposure that Tae-jun recognized as the expression of a man who had thought about this scenario. "Mr. Seo." Calvin's voice was even, reasonable. "I was hoping we could talk." "This is a private facility," Tae-jun said. "I know, I just need 5 minutes with Nia. That's all. 5 minutes, and then I'll—" "You're using credentials you weren't issued," Tae-jun said. "That's trespassing." Calvin's jaw moved. The reasonable expression held, but it was working harder now. "I just need to explain some things to her. She won't return my calls, and I understand she's angry, but there are things she's misunderstood about what happened between us, and if I could just— She doesn't want to talk to you." The sentence was flat. No anger in it, no threat, just the absence of any flexibility whatsoever. Calvin looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man trying to find the angle of approach that will work. Tae-jun had seen that look before, from people in much higher stakes situations than a parking structure confrontation, and he had learned that the look always preceded either escalation or retreat. Calvin chose neither immediately. With respect, he said carefully, this is between me and Nia. Whatever she's told you, you're only getting one side of... Security will escort you out, Tae-jun said. If you return to this property, I will pursue charges. If you attempt to contact Ms. Calloway through any means that she has not explicitly invited, I will ensure the relevant authorities receive the documentation we have compiled to date. Calvin went still. What documentation? He said. Tae-jun said nothing. And in the silence, something shifted in Calvin Rusk's face, the reasonable expression cracking just slightly at the edges, the calculation underneath it becoming briefly visible. He had not known there was documentation. He had been operating on the assumption that what he was doing existed only in Nia's private experience, in her fear and her silence and her inability to prove a pattern that was designed to be difficult to prove. He had not considered that someone else might have been watching. I think we're done, Tae-jun said. They walked him out. Calvin went without physical resistance, which was the smart move, and Tae-jun noted it. Smart meant controlled. Controlled meant he would regroup and come at this differently, and differently was the part that was going to require the most careful thinking. Tae-jun stood in the parking structure after Calvin's car had disappeared up the exit ramp, and let the cold cement and the fluorescent hum and the particular silence of a crisis that hadn't fully arrived yet settle around him. Behind him, the elevator dinged. He turned. Nia stood in the elevator doorway with her coat over her arm and her bag on her shoulder, looking at the space where two of his security team were still standing, looking at the exit ramp, looking at Tae-jun's face. She put it together in about 4 seconds. He was here, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her and she looked at him, and across the distance of the parking structure, in the bad light and the cold, he watched her process what it meant. That he had found his way inside. That the one place she had felt was contained had been breached. That the careful arrangement of the past 3 weeks had not been enough. Her face went through several things in quick succession. None of them the professional surface she wore upstairs. Then she said very quietly, I can't keep doing this. And the way she said it, not defeat, not collapse, but the quiet factual recognition of someone who has reached the actual limit of what they can manage alone. Told Tae-jun that the situation had just crossed from something they could manage carefully into something that was going to require a different kind of answer entirely. Tae-jun drove her home himself that night. Not Dae-soo. Him. He pulled his own car out of the executive bay and told Min-jae to follow at distance and said nothing else. And Nia got in without argument, which told him more about where she was than anything she could have said out loud. The woman who had pushed back on every arrangement, who had insisted on her own terms and her own decisions, and her right to manage her situation without someone else's hands on the controls. That woman got in the passenger seat and put her bag on her lap and looked straight ahead and didn't say a word for 11 blocks. The city moved past them in its nighttime way. Wet streets. Yellow light off the pavement. The particular indifference of Chicago at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday. The world continuing at its own volume while everything inside the car sat in a different register entirely. He knew which level, Nia said. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just a fact being turned over. Yes. Which means he'd been watching long enough to figure out we'd changed the route. Yes. She exhaled through her nose, a short, controlled sound. How long has he known? We don't know exactly. She nodded slowly like she was filing that away. He could see her doing what she always did when she received difficult information, not collapsing under it, but organizing it, cataloging it, finding the edges of it so she could understand its shape. He went through a subcontractor, she said. The credential belonged to a HVAC technician who finished his work on the 7th floor 10 days ago. We're still determining how Calvin obtained it. He's resourceful. She said it without any particular emotion. I used to think that was a good thing. Tae-jun said nothing to that. He pulled up in front of her building. She didn't move immediately. Her hands rested on top of her bag, and she looked at the entrance the way people look at places they're not certain are safe anymore. I'll have someone on the building tonight, he said. Visible, in the lobby. You won't see them, but the front desk will know. You don't have to... Nia. She stopped. Let me do this part, he said. The rest is yours. This part. Let me do this. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Okay, she said. She got out. He waited until she was through the door and the lobby light had closed around her before he pulled away from the curb and he drove back toward Blackstone Meridian with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set at an angle that Min-jae, following 2 car lengths back, recognized as the expression Tae-jun wore when he was choosing not to act on something he very much wanted to act on. Min-jae had seen that expression twice before. Both times, the person who'd caused it had eventually regretted it. The question of the credential came back with an answer by 11 the next morning, and the answer was worse than Tae-jun had prepared for. The HVAC technician's name was Roderick Hames. 44, 10 years with his company, clean record, no known connection to Calvin Rusk. Min-jae's team had spent the night retracing the contractor access logs, and what they found when they got deep enough into the records was not a break-in or a theft. It was a transaction. Roderick Hames had sold the access credential. Not Calvin directly. There was a buffer, a mutual contact, the kind of middle layer that people use when they want deniability. But the money had moved in a direction that ended at Calvin Rusk's personal account through 2 transfers that were constructed to look like something else and were not quite successful at it. He had paid for access to the building. He had planned this. He had identified a contractor, found a point of contact, arranged a financial exchange, and acquired the specific credential that would get him to the level where Nia's new exit route ended. He had done all of this after the security arrangements had changed, which meant he had known the arrangements had changed. Tae-jun sat at his desk and looked at the document Min-jae had laid in front of him and felt the situation shift under him like a floor discovering it had a crack in it. "He has a source," Tae-jun said. Min-jae stood at parade rest across the desk with the expression of a man delivering information he has verified 3 times because he knew it was going to land badly. "That's the most likely explanation. Inside the building, or adjacent to it. Someone who observed the changes to her access arrangements and communicated them. Not a formal member of the security team. No, the information is too general for that. What he received was behavioral. She's using a different exit. She's being driven. The timing has changed. That could come from a cleaning staff member, a lobby attendant, another floor's employee, anyone with eyes on her daily movements." Tae-jun put the document down with the particular careful deliberateness of a man preventing himself from doing something else with it. "Pull the access logs for every non-executive employee who interacted with the lobby or garage in the last month. Cross-reference against any financial anomalies." "Already started." "How long?" "End of day." "Make it sooner." Min-jae left. Tae-jun sat alone in his office and looked at the photograph of his father on the credenza and understood, with the specific unpleasantness of a lesson that arrives too late, that he had made an error. Not a catastrophic one, but an error nonetheless. He had tightened the visible perimeter and left the invisible one unwatched. Calvin had found the invisible one. The morning moved with the particular friction of a day that has already decided to be difficult. Tae-jun got through 2 calls and a board update without the quality of his attention being visible to anyone in the room, which required more effort than it usually did. He was tracking 2 things simultaneously, the work in front of him and the data coming in through Min-jae's investigation, and keeping those 2 tracks from intersecting in any way that would be legible to the people around him. Nia worked. She was in earlier than usual, which he noticed. 7:38. 15 minutes before her standard. She had the coffee going before he arrived at 7:49, which meant she had been in the building alone for 11 minutes, which meant she had decided that arriving early and being in the building while it was still largely empty was preferable to whatever the alternative had been. He didn't comment on the time. She didn't offer an explanation. They worked in the particular parallel quiet of 2 people who have moved past the stage where silence requires filling. At 10:45, she brought a contract revision to his desk. He was reviewing it when his secondary phone, the one that handled the other side of his life, buzzed once with a text from a number that wasn't stored under any name. He turned the phone face down. She didn't react. She had learned quickly in her first month that there were 2 phones and that questions about the second one were outside the scope of her position, and she had filed that fact away with the same professional neutrality she brought to everything that wasn't her direct business. He had always respected that about her. He was thinking about it differently now. At noon, Min-jae appeared. Not in person. A message, brief and specific, telling Tae-jun to come to the security office on the 2nd floor at his earliest convenience and using the particular phrasing that meant, "Don't delay this." He told Nia he had a facility matter to handle and took the stairs. The security office was a narrow room with 4 monitors and filing cabinets that were considerably more informative than their appearance suggested. Min-jae was standing in front of the center monitor with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has found the answer he was looking for and dislikes it considerably. On the monitor was a still image from an internal camera. The lobby, second angle, 3 days prior. Timestamp 6:57 a.m. In the image, a woman Tae-jun recognized, Portia Selms, 41, senior coordinator for building facilities, a Blackstone Meridian employee for 7 years, was standing near the lobby's side entrance, speaking on her personal cell phone. Her financial records, Min-jae said, show a deposit of $4,000 to her checking account 9 days ago. Source account is a shell that traces to the same network as the transfers Calvin used to pay for the credential. Tae-jun looked at the image. She's been here 7 years, he said. Yes. You're certain. The money moved. The calls match. She spoke to the same buffer contact twice in the 2 weeks before the credential purchase. Portia Selms had been a fixture of the building's daily operation for 7 years. She managed facility access requests, coordinated contractor schedules, handled the logistics of building maintenance. She had, in the ordinary course of her job, complete visibility into who was using which exits, which access arrangements had been modified, and what the timing of executive staff movements looked like. She had sold that visibility to a man stalking one of her colleagues. Tae-jun looked at the image for a moment longer. Then he turned away from the monitor. Pull her access immediately. Don't speak to her directly. Legal will handle the separation. He paused. Change every executive staff access code before end of business today. Don't explain the reason. Done. There's something else. Tae-jun looked at him. Min-jae pulled up a second window. It was an email thread, obtained through means Tae-jun wasn't going to question. The thread was between Portia Selms and an address that resolved to Calvin Rusk's personal account, and it went back further than 9 days. It went back 4 months. 4 months. The arrangement had been in place for 4 months, since July. Since 2 months before Tae-jun had noticed anything wrong, before the rooftop conversation, before the garage access and the driver, and all of it. Calvin had been receiving information about Nia's movements from inside the building for 4 months, which meant the gray sedan outside had never been Calvin working blind. He had always known when she was coming and going. He had always known how long she stayed. He had known everything. The breath Tae-jun took was the kind you take when you need to keep your face from doing something you don't want it to do in front of another person. Controlled, slow, through the nose. She didn't know what he was doing with the information, Min-jae said. Not as an excuse. Min-jae didn't deal in excuses, but as a factual clarification. The correspondence suggests she understood it as a man trying to reconnect with an ex. She framed it to herself that way. She sold information about a colleague's movements to a man who was stalking her. Yes. The framing doesn't change the function. No. Tae-jun looked at the second monitor and thought about 4 months. He thought about every evening Nia had stayed late, every lunch she'd eaten alone at her desk, every time she'd checked the windows before leaving and found the sedan there and felt her stomach drop and wondered how he always knew. He'd always known because someone in the building had been telling him. She had never been safe here, not once, not for a single day of the 18 months she had worked in this building. Does she know? Tae-jun said. Nia. Does she know about Portia? No indication. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. I need to tell her. Tae-jun. Min-jae rarely used his first name. When he did, it meant something. Think about what that information does to her. She's been using this building as her safe space for months. If you tell her someone inside was feeding him information, she needs to know. I understand that. I'm asking you to think about when and how. He was right. Tae-jun knew he was right. Timing was not cruelty. It was operational sense, and he was usually very good at it. But there was something in the 4 months, in the image of Portia Selms standing in the lobby at 6:57 in the morning while Nia was upstairs drinking coffee and believing she was contained, that made the usual calculus feel inadequate. He went back upstairs. Nia was on a call. He passed her desk and went to his office and sat behind his desk and looked at the skyline and did the thing he did when he needed to think past his own reaction. He made a list, not on paper, in his head. What was known, what was actionable, what the next 24 hours needed to produce. The list kept getting interrupted by the image on the monitor. At 2:15, she knocked on his open door. The Weller Group called back, she said. They want to move the closing meeting to Friday. I've already confirmed with your calendar, but I wanted to flag it. Fine. She was about to turn back when he said her name. She turned. He looked at her. Coat still on because she ran cold in the afternoons, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a pen she'd been carrying around since morning because she kept forgetting to put it down. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. The particular ordinary of a person who had been managing a crisis quietly for so long that they had gotten very good at looking like they weren't. Sit down, he said. Her expression shifted. Not alarm, but the particular attention of someone whose body has learned to read room changes before their conscious mind catches up. She sat. He told her. Not all of it at once. He gave it to her the way you give difficult information to someone you respect. Not softened, not clinical, but paced. The credential, the financial transaction, the internal source. He watched her face as each piece arrived, and what he saw was not what he expected. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She sat with her hands folded on her knee and her chin level and listened to the whole thing with the expression of someone for whom the information is terrible, but is landing on ground that has already been prepared for terrible things. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. 7 years, she said. Yes. She's been here 7 years. Yes. And I've been here 18 months. She looked at her hands. And she sold my schedule to him for $4,000. The flatness of the sentence was worse than anger would have been. Anger meant the walls were still up. That flatness was something further in. She didn't understand what she was enabling, Tae-jun said, and then immediately recognized it as the same qualified framing Min-jae had offered him, and recognized why it hadn't been sufficient then and wasn't now. Nia looked at him. She knew I was the subject, Nia said. She knew it was about me. She knew a man was paying her for information about when I left and when I arrived and which door I used. A pause. What did she think he was going to do with it? Plan a surprise party? Tae-jun said nothing. I used to bring her coffee, Nia said, from the cart downstairs. When I got my own, I'd get her one too. Black, 1 sugar. She looked at the window. I did that for a year. The silence in the room was the kind that doesn't benefit from anything being added to it. After a moment, Tae-jun said, Is there anyone else? Anyone you trusted in this building who might have had access to your movements and whose recent behavior has changed? She looked back at him slowly. You're asking me if there's another one. I'm asking you to think about it. She thought about it. He watched her do it, watched her go through the mental file she kept on every person in her professional environment, the careful cataloged attention she paid to people that was part of her competence and part of something older and more instinctive than competence. No, she said. I don't think so. A beat. But I also didn't think so about Portia. He took that. The codes have been changed, he said. Her access is revoked. Legal is handling the separation. You won't see her again. Nia nodded. She stood up, straightened her coat, picked up the pen she'd been carrying since morning. I need to finish the Weller file, she said. Nia, I'm fine. She said it differently than she usually said it. Not the professional wall of it. Something rawer. Not a performance of fine, but a genuine statement of what she needed to be right now in order to keep functioning. Let me work. It helps. He let her work. The afternoon ground through its hours. Tae-jun dealt with 3 calls and 2 meetings and a document review and handled all of it at a level of competence that was purely mechanical, his real attention running beneath the surface like a current under ice. He was building a problem in his head, a structural problem, the kind he was good at. Calvin Rusk had operated for at least 4 months with an inside source. The inside source was now eliminated. The credential access was closed. The security arrangements had been updated. On paper, the perimeter was tighter than it had ever been, but Calvin knew the perimeter had been tightened before and had found a way through it. He was not a man who ran out of angles. He was a man who treated obstacles as temporary conditions requiring adjustment. He would identify the new shape of the security arrangement, and he would find the new gap in it, and unless something fundamental changed, the cycle would repeat. Tae-jun had spent 10 years building an organization on a principle that was simple and brutal. You didn't manage a threat indefinitely. You resolved it. The legal route was the right move. He believed that, or he was choosing to believe it, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough. But the legal route was a process with a timeline, and timelines had gaps in them, and gaps were where things happened. At 5:40, his secondary phone buzzed. He looked at it. The message was from a number he recognized, a man whose professional services Tae-jun had used twice in 4 years, each time in circumstances that he had judged to be without viable alternative. The man's name was never written down anywhere. He had no digital footprint that mattered. He communicated in fragments that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't established the code. The message said, "Package confirmed. Instruction when ready." Tae-jun stared at it. He had not contacted this man. He had not initiated any communication in this direction. Someone in his organization, someone who had access to the secondary network and understood the situation with Nia, had made contact on his behalf or in his name, anticipating the instruction. His fingers didn't move. He sat with the phone in his hand for 30 seconds. The screen dimmed. He didn't touch it. Then he put it face down on his desk and looked at the window. In 10 years, there had been 2 times he had sent the instruction. 2 times he had made the judgment that the cost of resolution was proportionate to the scale of the problem. He did not think of those 2 times with pride, but he did not think of them with the particular horror that he understood he was supposed to feel, because he was a pragmatic man who had constructed a pragmatic world, and pragmatic worlds required pragmatic answers. The phone sat on his desk. He thought about Nia's hands pressed flat against the break room window. He thought about the hospital bracelet Min-jae had mentioned in the first report, old, worn, tucked inside her handbag. He thought about her voice on the rooftop saying 4, maybe closer to 5. He thought about the coffee she had carried to Portia Selm's desk every morning for a year. He thought about what she had said in the parking structure. "I can't keep doing this." Not a request, not directed at him, just a statement of a limit finally reached. He picked the phone back up. He did not send the instruction. He typed 3 letters, NLT, which in the code meant not this, and set the phone back down. He sat in his office until 6:30, long after the floor had emptied, and he understood that by closing that door he had accepted something. He had accepted that the resolution of this situation was going to be harder than one message and one outcome. He had accepted that it was going to take longer and require more exposure and carry more risk, and that he was going to have to maintain the discipline of the harder path even when the easier one was right there in his hand. He had accepted that because of what she had said on the rooftop. "You don't get to make decisions about my situation without asking me what I want." And because of what she had said tonight, sitting in his office with her hands folded on her knee, her voice completely flat. What did she think he was going to do with it? He turned the office light off at 6:32 and went to find her. She was in the small conference room with the Weller file spread across the table, her jacket off, her reading glasses on, a cold cup of coffee beside her elbow that she had clearly forgotten was there. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer." She pulled her glasses off, set them down. "If we build this properly," he said, "legally, completely, with everything Min-jae has compiled, the surveillance records, the financial transfers, the credential purchase, the internal source, it becomes a documented pattern. It becomes something that can't be quietly walked away from. But it requires you to make choices, formal choices. Your name on documents, your account of what happened given in formal settings." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do that tonight. I'm asking if you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. "And if I say yes," she said, "you'll do it that way?" "Yes." "Even though you could do it differently?" The question arrived without inflection. She wasn't accusing him. She was asking whether she had read him correctly, whether the version of him she had assembled from 18 months of proximity was accurate. He didn't look away. "Even though," he said, something moved across her face. Not relief. It was too complicated for relief. More like the particular quality of a person who has stopped bracing for impact and is recalibrating what they're bracing for. "Then yes," she said, "I'm willing." He nodded. He was about to leave her to the file when his phone, the regular one, buzzed with a text from the building's front security desk. He read it. Calvin Rusk had appeared at the main entrance 40 minutes ago. He had not attempted to enter. He had stood on the sidewalk in full view of the lobby cameras for 17 minutes, looking up at the building, and then he had left. He had not parked the sedan. He had arrived on foot. Tae-jun read the text twice. The change in method was not incidental. The sedan had been Calvin's observation post, his mobile surveillance base. Arriving on foot and standing openly on the sidewalk wasn't an attempt at access. It was a message. He knows we know, Tae-jun thought, and he's not leaving. He looked up from his phone and found Nia watching him. He had about 2 seconds to decide whether to show her the message, and in those 2 seconds he ran the calculation he'd been running since this began. What she needed to know, when she needed to know it, and whether giving her this particular piece of information tonight served her or only added to a weight she was already carrying past its limit. He showed her the message. She read it. She handed the phone back without a word. She put her glasses back on, picked up the Weller document, and kept working. And Tae-jun understood, watching her do it, that this was what courage actually looked like when it had been worn down past its presentable edges. Not dramatic, not defiant, not cinematic in any way, just a woman who had run out of the luxury of falling apart and had made the decision to keep her hands moving instead. He also understood that Calvin standing openly on the sidewalk, making himself visible, changing his method without warning, meant that the documented and measured approach they had just committed to was now in a race with a man who had nothing left to lose and had decided to start letting that show. The careful path was still the right path. But the careful path had just gotten considerably more dangerous, and the next move Calvin made was going to determine whether they had enough time to finish building the case before he did something that made the case irrelevant. The legal team worked through the weekend. Tae-jun didn't ask them to. He authorized the overtime, made the resources available, and let them work at whatever pace the work demanded, which turned out to be continuous. By Sunday evening, the lead attorney, a woman named Corinne Hast, 53, who had handled sensitive matters for Blackstone Meridian for 4 years, and who had the particular quality of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime in the previous decade, called Tae-jun's direct line and said the package was ready to submit. "How strong?" he said. "Strong enough," she said. "The financial transfers are documented. The surveillance pattern is documented. The unauthorized access to the building is documented with the credential transaction attached. The internal source is documented. Taken together, it establishes a course of conduct that satisfies the standard for a protective order and creates significant criminal exposure on the stalking statute." A pause. "It's good work. File it Monday morning. I'll need Ms. Calloway's signature on 3 documents before I can file. I'll have them to you by 8. He called Nia. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping. He didn't comment on that. He told her Corinne needed signatures and that he could bring the documents to her or she could come to the office early, whichever she preferred. She said she'd come in at 7:30. "You don't have to come in early," he said. "It's Sunday night." "I know," she said. "I want to." He understood that. The need to be doing something, to have your hands on the controls of your own situation. He understood it from a different angle, from the professional conditioning of a man who had learned that stillness was where mistakes crept in. But the structure of it was the same. 7:30, he said. 7:30, she said, and ended the call. He sat in his apartment with the secondary phone on the table in front of him, silent as it had been since Thursday's NLT. And he looked at it with the same focused neutrality he brought to most things that required him not to act on instinct. He had made the call, the harder path. He was staying on it. He went to bed at midnight and was awake by 5. Monday morning arrived with the specific gray weight of a Chicago November that has stopped pretending it might get better. The temperature had dropped overnight. The streets below were slick and cold, and the wind off the lake had the particular sharpness that made people pull their collars up and move faster than they intended to. Nia arrived at 7:26, 4 minutes early. She read all 3 documents before she signed any of them, which Tae-jun had expected and which Corinne, receiving the signed copies by secure message at 8:03, noted with the particular approval of an attorney who prefers clients who know what they're agreeing to. The filing went in at 9:17 a.m. Tae-jun was in a board call when it happened, watching the time on his secondary screen, and when 9:17 passed, he felt something he didn't have an immediate word for. Not relief, because relief implied the problem was resolved, and it wasn't, but a quality of forward motion. Things were in motion. The structure was built. Whatever Calvin did next would be happening inside a documented context that hadn't existed on Friday. It was something. The morning moved, the board call ended. 2 more calls followed. Nia brought him the afternoon schedule with a note attached. Corinne had already received a confirmation from the court clerk, and he read the note and set it down without ceremony because making ceremony out of it would have made it too large to sit comfortably in the day they still had to get through. At 12:41, Min-jae sent a message. 1 word. Movement. Tae-jun set his coffee down. He messaged back. Define. Min-jae. He went to her apartment building this morning. Didn't go in. Talked to the doorman. We don't know what was said. Tae-jun stared at the message. He was through his office door in 4 seconds. He crossed to Nia's desk where she was reviewing vendor proposals with the focused efficiency that had defined her professional self for 18 months. He leaned down and said very quietly, "Did you tell anyone outside this office that the filing was happening today?" She looked up, read his face. "No." "Why?" He showed her the message. He watched her eyes move across it, watched the small tightening at the corners of her mouth that was the only exterior sign of what was happening underneath. "He went to my building," she said. "Yes." "Before 9. "Before 9. She understood what that meant without him explaining it. He had been at her building in the morning hours, early, before most people's working day had begun, which put him there in the window when the filing was being finalized. Not a coincidence, a preemptive move, whether or not he knew specifically what was being filed. How was escalating. "I need you to call your doorman," Tae-jun said. "Ask him what Calvin said." She was already reaching for her phone. The call lasted 3 minutes. Tae-jun watched her face through it and tracked the information by watching what her expression did. At the 30-second mark, something sharpened. At a minute 40, her jaw set. By the end, she had the careful blank expression she wore when she was angry in a way she hadn't yet decided what to do with. She ended the call. "He told the doorman he was my brother," she said. "He asked which of the building's entrances I use in the mornings. He said he was trying to surprise me." Tae-jun felt something move through his chest. Hot. He controlled it. "Did the doorman tell him?" "Carlos has been my doorman for 2 years. He told Calvin he'd never seen any of my family visit and asked for ID." She set the phone down with a precision that was its own form of anger management. "Calvin left." "Good man." "Carlos, yeah." She exhaled. "He's adapting again." "Yes." She looked up at Tae-jun. "The filing didn't stop him." "The filing is a legal instrument. It creates consequences. It doesn't create walls." She nodded slowly. She had understood this already. He could see that she had. She was a smart woman who had been in this situation long enough to understand its physics. The filing was important. The filing was necessary. But a man who had spent 5 months mapping her life wasn't going to stop because of a document. He was going to stop when he was made to stop. Tae-jun went back to his office and called Min-jae. "He's shifting method," Tae-jun said. "No more sedan, foot approach, social engineering." He thought about the doorman. "He's trying to find gaps in the perimeter." "He'll find them," Min-jae said. Not pessimism, operational honesty. "Any perimeter has gaps. We're covering the primary points, but we can't cover everything." "I know." Tae-jun turned to the window. "What's his pattern for the next 24 hours? "He went home after the apartment building. No further movement this morning. But his office shows him out for the rest of the week. He's called in something or taken leave." A man who had cleared his schedule, who was operating on foot, who was no longer parking outside and watching, who was moving. "He's planning something," Tae-jun said. "Yes." "Today or tomorrow?" "Most likely." Tae-jun looked at the skyline and made 2 decisions very quickly, the way he made all decisions when the window was narrow. First, Nia would not be using any predictable route for the rest of the week. Second, the security coverage on her apartment would double by tonight. He made the calls. Then he sat at his desk and waited, which was the part he was worst at. The afternoon moved in a kind of suspended tension, the particular quality of hours that feel like they're moving slowly because you're waiting for something to happen inside them. Tae-jun dealt with the legitimate business of his day with sufficient competence that nobody in the building would have identified that he was operating at partial capacity. His real attention devoted to the monitor in the corner of his desk that showed Min-jae's surveillance feed in a small, silent window. At 3:44, his phone rang. Corinne Hast. The order was granted, she said, 45 minutes ago, signed and entered. Calvin Rusk is legally prohibited from approaching within 300 feet of Miss Calloway, her residence, and her place of employment. Violation is a criminal matter. Has he been served? Process server is attempting service now. He's not at his apartment. Not at his apartment. His office has him out. Moving on foot. Where's the server trying? His listed address on file. If he's not there by 5, we'll try again in the morning. Which meant Calvin Rusk did not yet know about the order. Which meant he was somewhere in the city, moving, without the knowledge that the legal consequence of that movement had just changed significantly. Tae-jun ended the call and messaged Min Jae. Order granted. Server can't locate him. He's mobile. Increase coverage. Min Jae's response came in 11 seconds. Already done. Eyes on the building, her apartment, and 2 probable intermediate routes. At 4:58, the building's lobby camera picked up Nia leaving the elevator and heading for the desk. Not the exit, just the desk, to drop off a package for the mailroom. 45 seconds on the lobby level. Routine. At 4:59, Calvin Rusk walked through the building's revolving door. The lobby monitor caught it. Min Jae's alert came through simultaneously. 2 vibrations on Tae-jun's phone, the double buzz that meant immediate. And Tae-jun was moving before the second vibration finished. He took the elevator because it was faster from his floor, and he needed to think during the descent. 31 floors. 30 seconds approximately. He used them. Calvin had timed it. He had been watching the entrance. From where, from what position, they'd figure that out later. And he had seen Nia in the lobby, and he had come through the door in the specific window when she was visible and accessible and away from the controlled environment of the executive floor. He was not operating randomly. He never had been. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level, and Tae-jun came through them, moving at the pace of a man with somewhere to be, which was controlled enough not to create a scene and fast enough to close the distance in time. He saw them from across the lobby. Nia had backed herself against the reception desk, not cowering, not collapsed, but creating the structure of the desk as a physical reference point between herself and Calvin, who stood 8 feet away with his hands open and his posture calculated to look non-threatening and his mouth moving in the measured cadence of a man delivering a prepared speech. 2 lobby security personnel were already in motion from their stations. Tae-jun made eye contact with the nearer one and lifted 2 fingers, hold, which stopped them without removing their presence. He crossed the lobby floor. Calvin heard his footsteps and turned. The prepared speech expression shifted. Something tightened in it, something that had probably been there underneath the whole performance, but was only now becoming visible. "This is between me and Nia," Calvin said. "Nothing between you and anyone in this building is private," Tae-jun said. "You're aware of that. I just need to talk to her." "She doesn't want to talk to you." Tae-jun stepped into the space between them. Not aggressive, not physical, just present. Just a body in a space that Calvin had been treating as open. That's not a recent decision she made when she was angry. That's a decision she made and has maintained and has now formalized through a process you'll be aware of shortly. Calvin's eyes moved to Nia, past Tae-jun. Trying to make the conversation bilateral, trying to force her engagement by looking at her instead of him. "Nia, I know you're angry. I know you think She asked you to stop contacting her." Tae-jun put himself in the eye line. 14 months ago. She asked you to stop, and you continued. She changed her number, and you found the new one. She changed her routines, and you mapped the new ones. You paid someone inside this building for information about her movements. He let that land. Watched Calvin's face when it did. The small, involuntary tightening, the tell of a man who didn't know that was known. "There is now a legal order. You will be served within the next few hours. The moment that service is completed, everything you are doing right now, standing in this lobby, being within this building, becomes a criminal matter." Calvin's jaw moved. Something behind his eyes was working very fast. "You don't understand what happened between us," he said. His voice had changed register. The prepared speech cadence was gone, and what was underneath it was rougher, less managed. "You only know what she's told you, and she's—" "Stop!" The word came from behind Tae-jun. Nia's voice. Tae-jun moved slightly to the side, not retreating, but creating the space she was clearly asking for. She stepped forward from the reception desk. She had her bag on her shoulder and her coat over her arm, and she looked like a woman who had made a decision in the last 30 seconds that had cost her something, but was going to cost her less than the alternative. She looked at Calvin directly. Something in her face that Tae-jun had not seen before. Not the professional surface, not the carefully maintained fine, not the flat anger of the conference room. Something older. Something that had been through enough that it had come out the other side into a different kind of steady. "You came to my building this morning," she said. "You told my doorman you were my brother." Calvin opened his mouth. "Don't." Her voice was even. "Don't explain it. Don't tell me you were worried about me or that it came from love or that I've misunderstood something. I've heard those explanations. I've sat across from you and listened to those explanations and believed them, and I spent 4 years building a life around someone who thought explaining himself absolved him of what he'd actually done." The lobby was very quiet. "I don't want 10 minutes, she said. "I don't want a final conversation. I don't want to hear about what you think happened between us, or what you think my anger is about, or what you think I owe you." She stopped, took a breath. "I want you to stop. That's all. That's every single thing I want from you. I want you to stop." Calvin looked at her. His face had done something complicated. The calculated composure, fracturing in layers. Something underneath it that was genuine distress or a performance of genuine distress, and Tae-jun had no interest in determining which. "Nia," Calvin said. Quieter now. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I know you don't think you are." Her voice didn't waver. "That's the part I stopped being able to explain to people. That you don't think you are." She shifted the coat on her arm. "Security is going to walk you out now. The next time you come anywhere near me, you'll be arrested. That's not a threat. It's just what's going to happen." She looked at Tae-jun. He nodded to the security team. 2 of them moved to Calvin's flanks, the practiced professional movement of men who knew how to make direction unavoidable without making it a confrontation. Calvin didn't fight it. He went. But in the 3 steps between his position and the revolving door, he turned and looked at Nia over his shoulder. And what was in his face was something that hadn't been there in any of the previous encounters. Something that had moved past calculation, past the rehearsed composure, into a territory that Tae-jun recognized because he had seen it before in different people in different rooms. The look of a man who had decided that consequences were someone else's problem. The revolving door took him. Nia stood in the middle of the lobby and breathed. Tae-jun waited. After a moment, she said very quietly, "He's going to do something." "Yes." "Soon." "Yes." She turned and looked at the revolving door where he'd been. "He's never looked at me like that before." Tae-jun had clocked the expression before it disappeared, and he agreed with her assessment, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, because she had earned the right to accurate information, and pretending would only leave her underprepared. "We increased coverage on your building this afternoon," he said. "Min-jae's team will be visible. Not intrusive, but visible. He needs to know that whatever he's thinking about doing will have witnesses." She nodded, still looking at the door. "Nia." She turned. "You did that well," he said. It wasn't the kind of thing he said easily. She seemed to know that. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face acknowledged the sentence for what it was. "It didn't feel well," she said. "It rarely does." She took the elevator back upstairs and finished the last 40 minutes of her day at her desk, with the focused determination of someone using work as the tool it is, a way of placing your hands on something solid when the rest of the ground is uncertain. Calvin Rusk was served with the protective order at 6:41 p.m. at a bar 4 blocks from his apartment by a process server who had been looking for him since 2 o'clock. Min-jae confirmed it with a text at 6:43. Tae-jun sent the confirmation to Corinne and to Nia simultaneously. Nia's response was 2 words, "Thank you." His response to that was nothing, because thank you didn't need an answer, and he was aware that answering it incorrectly would make it into something heavier than she'd intended. He worked until 8. The floor was empty by 7. He liked it this way. The building at night had a quality of honesty that the building during business hours didn't, the noise stripped away and the actual structure of things more visible. He was reviewing the Weller Group closing documents when the secondary phone buzzed. Not the NLT contact, a different number. Min-jae's secondary line, which he used only when the primary couldn't be used, which meant he was in a position where using his primary line wasn't safe or appropriate. Tae-jun answered immediately. Min-jae's voice was low and clipped. He went to a location in Pilsen 40 minutes ago, known to us. The person at that location has provided resources to individuals in difficult situations before. Unofficial resources. Tae-jun stopped moving. What kind? The kind that are useful when someone wants leverage and doesn't have conventional access to it. Leverage. Unofficial. Pilsen. Is he still there? Left 12 minutes ago, heading back toward the north side. We're tracking. Tae-jun's mind moved through the calculation fast. Calvin had been served with the order. He knew the legal structure was now in place. He knew Tae-jun's security arrangements. He knew that every conventional approach had been met and countered, so he had gone to find an unconventional one. What is the Pilsen contact deal in specifically? Tae-jun said. A brief pause. Information, private information, the kind that people want kept quiet. Tae-jun sat with that for 2 seconds. He's looking for something on me, he said. That's the most logical conclusion. Calvin had run out of ways to reach Nia through the front door. He was now attempting to find a way to reach her by undermining the structure that had formed around her. If he could find something on Tae-jun, something real, something that the other half of Tae-jun's life had generated over 10 years of careful and not entirely clean operations, he could use it as leverage, as a way of creating distance between Nia and the protection she'd been given, as a way of making Tae-jun pull back. He was smart. He had always been smart. That had always been the problem. How much does the Pilsen contact know? Tae-jun said. What they can gather from open-source intelligence, primarily. They're not a sophisticated operation, but they have connections in city records, property records, and some business registration databases. Is there anything in those sources? Another pause. Longer. There are subsidiary registrations, Min-jae said carefully, that a thorough person with the right search terms could connect to operations that would create complications. Complications. The word Min-jae used when he meant things that could end Tae-jun's freedom, his business, his carefully constructed decade of parallel existences. Tae-jun turned to the window, 31 floors up, looking at a city that had never particularly concerned itself with the private arrangements of the people who built things inside it, as long as those people were discreet. He had been discreet for 10 years. Calvin Rusk had gone looking for the seam in that discretion. I need to know everything the Pilsen contact could realistically find, Tae-jun said. Tonight. I need to know the exposure before he does. I'll have it in 2 hours. Make it 1. He put the phone down and sat in the dark and the quiet of his empty floor and felt the two halves of his life, which he had spent 10 years keeping separated by distance and discipline and a very specific kind of willful compartmentalization, begin moving toward each other with the momentum of something that had been building for a long time and had finally found its occasion. He had known this was coming. Not this specifically, not Calvin Rusk with a private information contact in Pilsen, but the general shape of it. The moment when the criminal architecture of Blackstone Meridian's hidden half would create a problem that the legitimate half couldn't solve. He had just always assumed, in the half-formed way that people assume things they don't want to examine directly, that he would be the one who chose the moment of collision, that he would manage it on his own terms, that the timing would be his. It wasn't going to be his. Min-jae called back in 53 minutes. The exposure was not catastrophic. It was also not nothing. There were 3 subsidiary registrations in Illinois business records that a sufficiently motivated researcher with the right entry points could trace to logistics operations that had, at various points over the past 6 years, facilitated the movement of things that Blackstone Meridian's legitimate charter did not cover. Nothing that pointed directly to Tae-jun's name in any document that was currently accessible, but a chain that, if someone pulled on the right link with enough force, would eventually arrive somewhere uncomfortable. Calvin had paid for a name and an entry point. What he did with it depended on what he found when he started pulling. Can we close the links? Tae-jun said. Some of them, not all of them tonight. Start tonight, close what can be closed. Already started. Tae-jun stood and walked to the window and looked at the street below. Wet pavement, the amber scatter of streetlights, the ordinary nighttime machinery of a city that didn't know and didn't care about the particular crisis unfolding on the 31st floor of one of its towers. He thought about the conversation with Nia in the parking structure. I can't keep doing this. He thought about what he had told her in the conference room. The harder path. The harder path had just developed a significant complication. Calvin was no longer just a man running a stalking pattern. He was now a man reaching toward information that could destabilize the entire structure around Nia and around Tae-jun, because he had determined that the legitimate protections she'd been given could only be defeated by making those protections impossible to sustain. He was going to try to take Tae-jun out of the equation. And the exposure Minji had identified meant that if Calvin found the right thread and pulled it, he might be able to. Tae-jun turned from the window. He had two options. He could get ahead of the information, move to close every accessible link before Calvin's contact could find it, manage the exposure legally and preemptively, accept the disruption to certain operations, and absorb the cost. That was the legitimate world solution. It would take time he wasn't certain he had, or he could go back to the secondary phone. He looked at it on the desk. Then he picked up the other phone, the regular one. He called Corinne Hast at 8:47 p.m., a time that most attorneys would object to being called. And Corinne, who had been retained precisely because she did not object to such things, answered on the second ring. "I need you to initiate an accelerated process," he said. "Everything we've filed, everything we have. I need the court date moved up. I need this resolved on the legal timeline before something else happens." "I can request expedited hearing," she said. "I can't guarantee it." "Request it anyway." "On what grounds?" "Violation of the order." He thought about the lobby. Calvin standing in the lobby after being told not to come near the building. He was in the building at approximately 4:59 today, before service was completed but after the order was entered. "I want that documented as behavior establishing imminent risk." He heard Corinne thinking, the particular silence of a thorough legal mind processing options. "If I frame it as a pattern of escalating behavior culminating in today's incident, combined with evidence of the information gathering through a third-party contact, I may be able to make the case for expedited consideration." A pause. "I'll need the third-party contact information. Min-jae will send it." "Tonight?" "Tonight." He ended the call and sent Min-jae the instruction, and then sat back in his chair and breathed and thought about Calvin Rusk at a bar in Pilsen, handing money across a table to a man who sold entry points into the quiet histories of powerful people. He thought about how close the secondary phone was. He thought about how much easier it would be. He picked up a pen. He signed the top document in the Weller Group file. He moved to the next one. He worked through the stack with the mechanical focus of a man who needs his hands occupied while his mind handles something larger. And when the stack was done, he set the pen down and sat in the quiet for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. Min-jae again. Not the secondary line this time, the primary. The message was 4 words. "He's at her building." Tae-jun was out of his chair and through the office door before the 4 words had finished assembling themselves into full meaning, moving toward the elevator with the controlled speed of a man who has run this kind of calculation before. Distance, time, assets in place, what was already there, and whether it was enough. He was in the elevator, pressing the garage level, calling Min-jae before the doors closed. "Situation," he said. "He's on the sidewalk outside her building. One of our people has eyes on him. He hasn't approached the entrance. He's on his phone." "Who's he calling?" "We don't know." "Is Nia inside?" "Yes. Lights on. 3rd floor." Tae-jun's car was in the executive bay. He was moving through the garage. "He's been served. He's in violation right now." "Yes. Our person on site has already called it in. Police response estimated 9 to 12 minutes. 9 to 12 minutes. The distance from Blackstone Meridian to her building in current traffic was 7 to 9. "Keep him on the phone," Tae-jun said. "Your guy. Eyes on Calvin. Don't approach. Don't tip. Wait for police and wait for me." He got in the car. He drove. The streets were wet and the signals were the kind of cooperative that they are only when you can't afford them not to be, and he made it in 8 minutes, which was the kind of outcome that happens when every other element of a situation has been terrible and the universe decides one thing can go right. He turned onto her block and saw the situation before he fully stopped the car. Calvin was not on the sidewalk. Calvin was in the entrance alcove of Nia's building, speaking through the intercom panel, and the building's front door was— Tae-jun registered this with a cold, dropping feeling in his chest. Standing open. The door was open. Someone had already buzzed him in, or he had followed someone in, or the door mechanism had failed, and the specific details of how were entirely irrelevant because the fact was that he was inside the alcove and the door was open and Nia was on the third floor, Tae-jun's man on the street. A compact, watchful presence named Jonah, who had been with Min-jae's team for 3 years, was already moving from his position down the block, closing the distance, speaking into his earpiece. Tae-jun got out of the car. He moved to the entrance with the specific economy of movement of a man who has made a decision and doesn't need to revisit it. Calvin heard him and turned from the intercom, and the expression on his face was one Tae-jun had been watching evolve for weeks. From the reasonable, composed exterior to the fractured calculation of the parking structure, to the look in the lobby this afternoon that had moved past all of that into somewhere rawer and less managed. Tonight it had moved further still. He looked like a man who had spent the day pulling on threads that went nowhere and had arrived at this sidewalk having run out of every option except the one in front of him. "You're in violation of a court order," Tae-jun said. "I need to talk to her." "You need to leave." "I need—" Calvin's voice broke on the word, and he caught it and pulled it back, and the effort of pulling it back was visible on his face. "You don't understand what you've done. You think you're protecting her. You're not protecting her. You're making everything worse. If she would just talk to me for 10 minutes, I could explain." "There is nothing to explain." "There is." The rawness in his voice had moved all the way to the surface now. "There are things that happen that she doesn't know about, things I haven't been able to tell her, and if you would just let me—" "She told you what she wanted in the lobby today." Tae-jun kept his voice flat and controlled. "She was clear. Whatever explanation you think you have, she doesn't want it. That's not your decision. It's not mine. It's hers, and she made it." Behind Calvin, through the open door, the building's elevator had arrived at the lobby level. Through the small, reinforced glass panel in the stairwell door, Tae-jun could see the lobby indicator. 3rd floor. The elevator hadn't been called from the lobby. It had been sent down. From the 3rd floor. She had heard the intercom. Calvin saw the change in Tae-jun's eyes before he registered what it meant. And he turned. And in that turning, that single moment of divided attention, Jonah came through the entrance alcove from the street side and positioned himself between Calvin and the inner door with the practiced physical presence of a man whose job is to be an obstacle. Calvin stopped. The elevator was descending. Tae-jun tracked it in his peripheral vision and thought, fast and hard, if she comes out into this lobby right now, the situation tips. If she's behind a closed door on the 3rd floor, the situation is contained. He needed her to not be in the lobby. He pulled out his phone and sent her a text with the speed of someone who has learned to type one-handed while doing other things. "Stay on your floor, door locked. I'm downstairs. Police in 4 minutes. 3 seconds of waiting. 3 seconds that felt like something geological. Then a read receipt appeared. Then, from above, no sound of elevator movement. She had stopped it. She was staying on the floor. Tae-jun exhaled one breath and turned his full attention back to Calvin, who was looking at him with Jonah at his back and the blocked entrance in front of him, and the expression of a man who has just performed the calculation of his options and found the number smaller than he needed it to be. "This is over," Tae-jun said. "Not the way you want it to be over. Not with an explanation or a final conversation or anything that gives you the resolution you came here for. Just over. Tonight. The police are 4 minutes out. You have those 4 minutes to decide whether this ends with you leaving or with you being arrested on this sidewalk." Calvin's jaw worked. The rawness in his face was real. Tae-jun was watching a man who was genuinely in pain, which was the part of this that complicated the simple moral mathematics. Calvin Rusk was not a monster in the way that monsters were easy to deal with. He was a man who had loved someone the wrong way, and then refused, at every stage, to accept that his love didn't obligate her response. And the refusal had calcified over 14 months into something that had stopped resembling love and started resembling ownership, and he either couldn't see that or had stopped trying to. "You took her from me," Calvin said. Quiet now. The anger underneath gone soft, which was sometimes worse. "You stepped into something that was between us and you." "She was already gone," Tae-jun said. "She left 14 months ago. Whatever you're trying to get back wasn't there when you arrived." Calvin looked at him. "There's nothing to go back to," Tae-jun said. "There's nothing in that building you're entitled to." A siren, distant, growing. Calvin heard it. The 4 minutes had been 3. Something in his face collapsed then. Not dramatically, not in the way collapse looks in the stories people tell about moments like this. Just a settling. A descent from the position he'd been holding. He looked at the building entrance, then at Tae-jun, then at the street where the police lights were starting to color the wet pavement blue and red. He put his hands in his pockets, and he stood there perfectly still while two officers came down the block at a pace that said they'd been briefed and understood the situation, and Jonah gave them the brief from his position at the entrance, and Tae-jun stood where he was and watched Calvin Rusk understand, really understand, in the specific way that understanding lands when it arrives in the form of two uniformed officers and a court order on a phone screen, that the thing he had refused to accept for 14 months had been true all along. She wasn't coming back. She had never been coming back. One of the officers addressed Calvin. Standard, professional, procedural. Calvin answered in a voice that was composed in a way that had something broken underneath it. He was being cited for violation of the protective order. He was being detained for processing. He didn't fight it. In the moment before they led him to the cruiser, Calvin looked up at the building's face. Third floor, the lit window. And what was in his expression in that moment was something that Tae-jun didn't have a clean name for and didn't particularly want one. The cruiser door closed. The street went back to being a street. Tae-jun stood in the entrance alcove with Jonah and looked at the space where Calvin had been standing and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has held himself at a specific tension for a long period and has just been permitted, provisionally, to release it. He texted Nia. "He's gone. Police have him. You're safe." The response was immediate. One word. "Okay." He looked at that word for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and looked up at the lit window on the third floor. And after a moment, the light shifted. She had moved away from the window or drawn a curtain, and the face of the building went back to being just a building. He got back in the car. He sat there for a long moment before he started the engine. His hands on the wheel were steady, which was the thing about control. It held until it held, and then it was simply a question of whether you'd gotten to the end of the situation before the end of the control arrived. He had. This time. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb into the wet Chicago night. And behind him, 2 blocks away, a police cruiser carried Calvin Rusk toward the specific set of consequences that had been building since the first evening. A gray sedan had parked across the street from Blackstone Meridian Tower and begun its patient, meticulous wait. The wait was over. What wasn't over? What Tae-jun understood with the particular clarity of a man who had spent the drive over running the calculation was the other thing. The Pilsen contact. The subsidiary registrations, the information Calvin had gone looking for, which existed in certain databases regardless of tonight's arrest, which would still be accessible tomorrow and the day after. He had bought time tonight. He had not resolved the exposure. And the exposure, Min Jae's careful word for the threads in business records that led, if you pulled them correctly, to operations that Blackstone Meridian's legitimate face had no knowledge of, was the thing that was still sitting in the dark, waiting to see what Calvin's contact had already found before the arrest had interrupted whatever Calvin had been planning to do with it. Tae-jun drove through the November night and understood that the arrest was not the ending. It was the moment before the ending, and the ending was going to require him to make a decision. He had been postponing for a very long time, one that had nothing to do with Calvin Rusk and everything to do with the man he had been looking at in the mirror every morning for 10 years, and whether that man was someone he was still willing to be. He didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid. Fear was a thing he had learned to metabolize into something useful, and there was nothing useful left to extract from this particular evening. He didn't sleep because there was a decision waiting for him in the dark that he had been refusing to sit with directly. And now that Calvin was in a holding cell and Nia was behind a locked door on the 3rd floor of her building, and the immediate crisis had reached its provisional pause, the decision was the only thing left in the room with him. He sat in the chair by the window of his apartment and looked at the city until 4 in the morning. Then he picked up the phone, the regular one, and called Min Jae. Min Jae answered without greeting, because a call at 4 a.m. from Tae-jun didn't require one. "I need to know the full scope," Tae-jun said. "Everything, every operation, every subsidiary, every connection that has exposure. I need it documented comprehensively, not for legal purposes, not yet. I need to understand the whole shape of it." A pause. "Tae-jun," Min Jae's voice was careful. "What are you thinking?" I'm thinking that I've been managing two things for 10 years by keeping them separated, and they stopped being separated the moment Calvin Rusk walked into a bar in Pilsen. I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with. Another pause. Longer. It'll take a few days to compile properly. Take what you need, but start tonight. He ended the call and sat back in the chair and looked at the skyline until the dark started giving way to the particular pale gray of a Chicago morning in November. And in that long transition between night and day, he understood something he had been approaching from the edges for weeks. The empire he had built, the legitimate half and the half that wasn't, had felt like two separate things because he had constructed them to feel that way. Separate accounts, separate personnel, separate chains of decision and consequence. He had maintained the separation with the discipline of a man who understood that compartmentalization was the only viable architecture for the life he was living. But the architecture had a flaw. He was the load-bearing wall between the two halves. Whatever lived on one side of him lived in proximity to what was on the other side. And any person who got close enough to him, genuinely close, the way you got close to someone when you trusted them with the shape of your actual life, existed in the shadow of both. Nia didn't know about the other half. She had worked for him for 18 months and managed the legitimate operation with a competence that had repeatedly astonished him, and she had done all of it without access to the part of the building she wasn't supposed to see. He had ensured that. He had been careful. But Calvin had found Pilsen, which meant the wall was thinner than he'd told himself. And if the wall was thin enough that a stalker with a $4,000 information budget could find the edge of it, it was thin enough for other things too. He went to his desk at 6 a.m. and started reading. Not Min Jae's report. That was still days away. He read the documents he already had. The subsidiary registrations, the historical filings, the chain of entities that ran from the visible face of Blackstone Meridian Holdings downward through several layers of deliberately obscure structure to operations that he had justified over the years, with the particular moral arithmetic of a man who was careful to keep the violence at a distance. He read it all the way through for the first time in years. He was still reading at 7:30 when Nia arrived. He heard the elevator, her footsteps on the marble, the specific rhythm of a person who had made it through a night that tested whether she still could and had come out on the other side still moving. She appeared in his office doorway. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, dark gray, longer than her usual, and she had a coffee in each hand, which meant she had stopped at the cart downstairs, which meant she had given thought, on a morning when she had every reason to think only about herself, to whether he had eaten or rested. She set one of the coffees on his desk without comment. He looked at it, then at her. She looked tired in a way that sleep would help but wouldn't entirely fix. Her eyes were clear, but the area beneath them had the particular worn quality of a person who had been holding something at sustained tension for a very long time and was only now beginning to understand what it had cost. "How are you?" he said. She considered the question seriously, which was something he had come to expect from her. She didn't use words reflexively. She used them deliberately. "I'm intact," she said. "I think that's the most accurate thing. Intact is good. It's enough for this morning." She looked at the documents spread across his desk. "What's all this?" He looked at the documents, then back at her. "Something I should have looked at more carefully a long time ago," he said. She read his face with the attention she always brought to reading his face, and he watched her understand that this wasn't something she was going to be given more of right now, and he watched her make the decision to accept that without pushing. She nodded once and went to her desk. He drank the coffee. Corinne Haas called at 9:47 with the update on Calvin's processing. He had been held overnight. He was being arraigned that morning on the stalking statute and the protective order violation, which carried real weight because of the documented pattern Min Jae's compilation had established. His attorney, he had one, which meant he had been expecting legal consequences long enough to have prepared for them, was likely to argue for conditions rather than detention. But Corinne's read on the judge was that the documented evidence of the Pilsen contact and the building infiltration would push towards stricter terms. "Best case for us," Corinne said, "is an emergency modification of the order with enforced distance conditions and mandatory counseling. Realistic case is that he gets released on bond with conditions. Worst case is a sympathetic judge who sees a heartbroken man in a civil dispute. What's your read? Middle outcome. Conditions. Released. We'll have to be vigilant." A pause. But the documented pattern is strong. His attorney is going to have a difficult time minimizing it. Tae-jun thought about the Pilsen contact, the information Calvin had been seeking. Corinne, if someone had been gathering information on Blackstone Meridian's subsidiary structure through a private intelligence source, is there a proactive way to address that? A longer pause this time. Corinne Haas dealt in sensitive matters and had learned over 4 years of working with Tae-jun to read the specific shape of questions that were about more than they appeared to be. That depends on the nature of the subsidiary structure, she said carefully, and on what someone might find in it. Assume they might find connections that require attention. The pause that followed was professional and precise. In that case, she said, the most defensible posture is usually voluntary remediation before discovery. Courts and regulators respond significantly better to a company that identified and addressed its own exposure than to one that had it found. Voluntary remediation. He had known that was the answer before he asked. He had been asking because he needed to hear it from someone outside his own head. I'll be in touch, he said, and ended the call. He called Min-jae next. Calvin's in processing, Min-jae said. Our people are at the courthouse. Leave them there. I need something else. He looked at the documents on his desk. I need you to start identifying a legal firm that handles regulatory compliance and voluntary disclosure. Not Corinne, a separate firm. Someone who specializes in unwinding complicated structures. The silence on Min-jae's end was the longest one he had ever produced. Tae-jun, he said. I know. This is not a small thing. I know. It'll take years, and it will cost. I know what it'll cost. He leaned back in his chair. I've been running a calculation for 10 years about whether the structure was worth the cost. I think I've been running it wrong. Another silence, different from the first. Min-jae was many things, but among them he was a man who had stayed with Tae-jun across decisions that had not always been clean, and who had done so with his eyes open, and who had the particular loyalty of someone who had made his own choices and was willing to own them. I'll find the firm, Min-jae said. Use someone outside our usual network, someone who doesn't know the existing structure. Understood. He ended the call and sat at his desk in the morning light and felt the particular sensation of a man who has picked up something very heavy and understands, now that it's in his hands, that setting it down was always going to be more complicated than picking it up. The day moved. Calvin's arraignment produced a middle outcome, as Corinne had predicted. Released on bond. Conditions. No contact. Mandatory distance. Biweekly check-ins with a court officer required psychological evaluation as a condition of bond maintenance. His attorney had argued vigorously. The documented pattern had argued back more vigorously. Corinne called with the details and said the evaluation requirement was the piece she'd pushed hardest for and had not expected to get. It's not a guarantee, she said, but it puts a professional in a position to assess whether he's a sustained risk. That matters. What's the realistic timeline on the underlying case? 8 to 14 months to resolution, assuming no escalation. 8 to 14 months. Nia had been managing this for 18. 8 to 14 more was not an abstraction. It was a real span of time that a real person had to live inside. He thought about the exhaustion under her eyes that morning, the particular worn quality of a person who has been vigilant for too long. He would tell her about the arraignment outcome directly. Not filtered, not softened. She deserved accuracy. He told her at noon, at her desk, standing in the way he had learned was less formal than calling her into his office, that she processed things more readily when the conversation happened in her own space. She listened to all of it. Conditions, timeline, evaluation requirement. 8 to 14 months, she said. Yes. She breathed through her nose. That's a long time. It is. But it's a real timeline. It has an end. It has an end. She looked at the desk for a moment, then, is he going to keep trying? I don't know. The evaluation requirement changes his operating context. The conditions create real legal exposure for any violation. People make different calculations when the math gets harder. He paused. But I can't promise you what he'll decide. She nodded. She had not expected a promise. I want to call my mother, she said. I haven't told her any of this. She's in Atlanta. She calls every Sunday, and I've been managing what I let her know for about 5 months. She pressed her lips together briefly. I want to call her tonight and actually tell her. Good, he said. It's going to be a very long call. Probably. She looked up at him with a quality in her expression that he had been watching develop over the past weeks. Something that had started out as guarded recognition and had moved through gratitude and something more complicated than gratitude and had arrived this morning at a directness that didn't need any of the professional furniture around it. You're okay, she said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a check. I'm handling some things, he said. What kind of things? Business things. Old decisions that need revisiting. She held his gaze for a beat. The directness in her expression didn't waver. Okay, she said. Just that. She didn't push. She had learned something in the past months about what it meant to let someone handle their own situation in their own time, and she applied that learning with the same precision she applied to everything. He went back to his office. The next 3 weeks were the kind of weeks that look ordinary on the surface and are actually the period when everything real happens. Tae-jun met with the compliance firm Min Jae had identified, Gerber and Rice, a boutique with a specific practice in what they called structural remediation, on a Tuesday evening in an office that wasn't connected to any of his existing corporate addresses. He sat across from a partner named Thomas Gerber, 61, a man with the careful eyes of someone who had been in a room with a lot of people in complicated situations and had learned not to let the complication become personal. Tae-jun told him the shape of it. Not everything. Enough. The subsidiary chain, the historical operations, the nature of the exposure. He was precise and accurate and didn't attempt to minimize, because minimizing to a compliance attorney was the fastest way to make the problem worse. Gerber listened. When Tae-jun finished, Gerber sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at him. The voluntary disclosure path is long, Gerber said, and it requires a genuine commitment to restructuring that can't be performed. Regulators have seen performed restructuring. They don't respond well to it. It won't be performed. Gerber looked at him. You understand that this process will cost you operational capacity. Revenue streams that currently exist will be closed. I understand. Some of those closures may attract scrutiny regardless of voluntary action. I can't guarantee immunity. I know. Why now? Gerber said. What changed? It was a direct question from a man who had learned to ask direct questions. Tae-jun considered it genuinely. Someone who shouldn't have been affected by the exposure nearly was, he said. That's not the whole answer, but it's the honest one. Gerber studied him for a moment. All right, he said. We'll start with a full structural audit. That takes 60 to 90 days. Nothing is filed and nothing is disclosed until you've reviewed the audit and made the decision with full information. 60 days, Tae-jun said, not 90. 60 is aggressive. I know. Gerber looked at him for another beat, with the expression of a man recalibrating his initial assessment. 60 days, he said. They shook hands. Tae-jun drove back to the office in the November dark and thought about the word that Gerber had used. Commitment. The particular way it landed when it was applied not to a goal but to a process. When what was being committed to was not the destination, but the dismantling of the architecture that had gotten you there. He had built something. He had spent 10 years building it with precision and discipline and a willingness to tolerate costs that other people wouldn't, and it had served the purposes he'd designed it for. And now he was going to take it apart, piece by piece, in a room with a compliance attorney and the particular slow machinery of regulatory process, and the only victory available at the end of that process was the absence of something, the absence of exposure, of threat, of the thing that had nearly destroyed the only clean part of his life. It wasn't a satisfying victory. He had understood it wouldn't be. He had made the calculation anyway. Min Jae, when Tae-jun told him the full scope of what was beginning, was quiet for a long time. They were in the security office on the second floor, the monitors dark except for the building feeds, the late hour having reduced the operational world to its minimum. The people below us, Min Jae said finally, the ones involved in the operations that will be closed, some of them will be exposed by the disclosure process. I know. And the ones who aren't exposed, they lose their operational income. I know. You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks. Min Jae turned his coffee cup on the desk. A slow rotation. There's a way to do this that minimizes the cascade. Close from the outside in. Give people time to transition. The disclosure can be structured to address the entity level without necessarily reaching every individual. Gerber said the same thing. Gerber is good. He's very good. Tae-jun looked at the monitors. It won't be painless. There's no version of this that's painless. No. But there's a version that's honest. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? I need you to stay. Through the process, I need someone who knows the whole structure helping to dismantle it. I'm not going anywhere, Min-jae said, with the simplicity of a man for whom loyalty was not complicated. They sat in the quiet for a while after that. Two men in a small room at the edge of a very large decision, not requiring anything more from the moment than the moment was already giving. Calvin's second evaluation took place in early December, 6 weeks after the arraignment. His court-appointed evaluator filed a report that Corinne shared with the relevant parties, carefully, within legal parameters, and the report identified patterns of behavior consistent with a control-oriented attachment disorder and recommended continued therapeutic intervention. It was clinical language. It described, in the dry vocabulary of professional assessment, the same thing Nia had described on the rooftop of Blackstone Meridian Tower in the plain vocabulary of lived experience. Calvin did not violate the conditions of his release in those 6 weeks. He had, finally, run out of angles. Tae-jun thought about that, about what it had taken to produce that outcome. Not just the arrest, not just the legal filing, but the months before it. The garage access, the changed codes, the driver, the surveillance, the rooftop conversation, the conference room at 9 o'clock, the lobby, the entrance alcove on a wet November night, the harder path. He had stayed on it. The cost of staying on it was still being calculated and would be for some time, but he had stayed on it, and somewhere in the staying, something in him had changed that he didn't have a precise name for. It wasn't softening exactly. He was not a soft man, and he was not going to become one. It was more like a correction, like a building that has been constructed with a subtle lean over 10 years and has finally had someone put a level against it and say, that's not true. He was dealing in true. The annual winter reception for Blackstone Meridian was held in the second week of December. Tae-jun went because going was expected, and he moved through the room with the practiced social competence of a man who had been doing this for a decade, saying what needed to be said and meaning approximately half of it and managing the ratio effectively. He saw her across the room at 9:15. She was wearing midnight blue. Her hair was up. She was talking to two of the younger floor managers with an ease that he recognized as genuine, not the performed ease of someone managing a professional social situation, but the actual ease of a person who has enough space in herself now to be present in a room. She looked different from the woman he had found crying alone at a desk 11 months ago. Not different in the way that people mean when they mean changed. The same person, the same precise intelligence, the same warmth, the same capacity for directness that had always been there underneath the professional surface. But different in the way a person is different when they have been in a storm and have come through it with a clearer understanding of what they're made of. She caught his eye across the room. She excused herself from the conversation and crossed toward the glass doors to the terrace. She stopped and looked back at him once, which was not an invitation exactly, but was close enough. He followed. The terrace was cold and the city was doing what Chicago did in December. The particular brutal beauty of it, all steel and light and zero sentimentality. Snow was moving in from the lake, not heavy yet, just the suggestion of it. The warm light from the reception room fell through the glass and softened the edges. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and she was looking at the skyline. He stood beside her. I walked in this morning without checking the street, she said. He looked at her. First time in about 2 years. She kept her eyes on the city. I got halfway to the entrance and realized I hadn't looked. And then I stood there for a second trying to decide if I should go back and look or keep moving. What did you decide? I kept moving. A beat. It felt very strange, like forgetting something important and then realizing it's not important anymore. He understood that. The way vigilance becomes habit, and habit becomes the shape of how you move through your days, and then one day you move differently, and the absence of the old shape is its own kind of sensation. The evaluation update came through this week, he said. Calvin's third session. The evaluator's language is shifting. Gerber read it as encouraging. Corinne told me. She nodded. I'm not celebrating it, not yet. That's reasonable. But I'm not afraid of it either, the way I was. She turned her head slightly and looked at him from the side. That's different. That's actually different, not just me telling myself it is. He said nothing. He let it be what it was. She turned to face him more fully. The cold had put color in her face, and the light from inside was doing something warm and indirect to the planes of it, and she was looking at him with the directness that had always been her most precise feature. Not aggressive, not demanding, just honest. Looking at him the way people look at someone when they're saying something true. You're changing something, she said. He looked at her. About the business, the way you run things. She read whatever crossed his face. I don't need you to tell me the details. I know there are things about how this organization operates that I've worked around for 18 months without asking about them, because asking was outside my lane, and because I trusted— She stopped. Because I trusted that you were someone who had reasons. I had reasons, he said. I know. She looked at the city. Are you okay with how this ends? With whatever you're changing? The question was direct and personal, and in another version of this conversation, with another version of himself, he would have deflected it with something general and useful. He looked at the city and thought about Gerber and the 60-day audit and the cascade that was already beginning in the outer edges of the structure. No, he said. Not okay with it, but clear about it. That's different. She nodded. I spent 4 years with someone who was never clear, she said. Clear is worth a lot. They stood on the terrace in the cold for another minute. Below them, the city moved in its ordinary way, traffic and light, and the beginning of the snow coming off the lake. Inside, the reception continued. Neither of them was in a hurry to go back to it. Mr. Seo, she said, you've been calling me that for 18 months. 19, she corrected, without missing a beat. Then, Tae-jun. He looked at her. She was not smiling. She was not performing anything. She was just looking at him with the particular quality of a person who has arrived, after a very long and difficult passage, at a place that is solid enough to stand on. Thank you, she said, not for protecting me. I know you're going to say something about that you just held the space or whatever, so I'm saying thank you for something more specific. She looked at his face. You gave me back the belief that I could read people. After 4 years of telling myself I was wrong about everything, you were someone I was right about. That matters more than anything you organized or arranged or prevented. The sentence landed in a place that he hadn't been expecting to be hit, which was unusual for him. He stood with it for a moment. You were right about most things, he said. Some of the things you didn't know to read were in rooms you weren't supposed to be in. She tilted her head. The business things you're changing, she said. Yes. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then, are you closing the rooms I'm not supposed to be in? He thought about Gerber, about the 60-day audit, about Min-jae saying I'm not going anywhere with the simplicity of a man for whom loyalty is not complicated. Working on it, he said. She looked at him for a long time after that, long enough that the snow from the lake had started coming down more seriously, small flakes catching the light from inside and the light from the city below and coming apart in the wind before they could settle. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not urgency, not drama, just her hand closing around his in the cold. The way you hold on to something you've decided to hold on to because you've run the calculation and the answer came back clear. He didn't let go. They stood there with the snow and the city between them and 31 floors of building beneath their feet. While inside the reception continued and the rest of the world remained entirely uninformed about the particular shift that had just occurred on a terrace in December. The audit took 62 days. 2 days over, Tae-jun had objected and Gerber had simply looked at him over the desk and said 2 more days produces a defensible document, and Tae-jun had accepted that because Gerber was right, and accepting that Gerber was right was the kind of thing he was learning to do. The audit was thorough. It was not comfortable reading. He read it in full, alone, over a weekend in January. He sat at the kitchen table of his apartment with the document and a pot of coffee, and the particular honest reckoning of a man who had decided that the problem with the version of himself that had built this structure was not that the structure had been built. He understood the conditions and the history and the particular world in which it had made a certain kind of sense, but that he had continued building it long past the point when those conditions were still the conditions of his life. He had kept it because it worked, because it was powerful, Because power, in the world he'd come from, was the thing that kept other things safe. He understood now what he'd gotten wrong about that. What he'd built had made him powerful. What he was dismantling was making him safe. The first voluntary disclosure was filed in late January. Gerber managed the process with the precision and care that Tae-jun had known he would, and the initial regulatory response was what Gerber had predicted: cautious interest, follow-up questions, the machinery of institutional review beginning its slow turn. Tae-jun answered every question, completely, without creative interpretation. Min-jae coordinated the internal transitions, the operational closures, the personnel affected, the careful sequencing of an unwinding that was designed to minimize cascade while not hiding the fact of what was being unwound. It was difficult work. It took longer than either of them wanted. There were days when the scale of what was being dismantled made the whole enterprise feel less like remediation and more like a controlled demolition performed by hand. On a Tuesday in March, Min-jae sat across from Tae-jun's desk and put a summary document on the surface. "Last subsidiary," he said. Tae-jun looked at the document, then at Min-jae. "What's left after this closes?" "Blackstone Meridian Holdings, legitimate and complete. The logistics arm, real estate, security services, the property management division." Min-jae's face was as unreadable as it always was. But there was something in his eyes, not satisfaction exactly, but the quality of a man who has finished a thing that needed to be finished. 3,200 people employed in operations that are entirely clean. Tae-jun looked at the summary document. He picked it up and read through it with the attention he brought to everything that mattered, and when he finished, he set it back down and signed the authorization at the bottom. The last subsidiary closed on a Friday afternoon in March. He didn't mark it, didn't announce it. Went home that evening the way he went home any other evening, and sat in his apartment and looked at the city and felt the particular weight of a completed thing. Not light, not triumphant, just finished. Solid in the way that only finished things are solid. Calvin Rusk's criminal case resolved in April. The outcome was a conditional sentence. No incarceration, but a 3-year probation with mandatory continued counseling, strict maintenance of the no-contact order, and a criminal record that would follow him through any professional or social context where background checks mattered, which was increasingly most of them. His attorney had argued for expungement eligibility. The judge had not agreed. Corinne called Tae-jun with the news at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. He walked to Nia's desk. She was reviewing a budget proposal with the reading glasses on and the pen in her hand, and she looked up when he appeared. He told her. She pulled the glasses off, held them in both hands, looked at the desk for a moment in the way she looked at difficult information, directly, without flinching, giving it the space to be what it was. "Is it over?" she said. "The case is resolved. The order is permanent. He's on probation for 3 years. He paused. "Over as much as it can be. He'll have to choose to make it more than that." She nodded slowly. He watched her absorb it. Not with relief, not with the dramatic exhale of a weight finally lifted. With the quiet, contained recognition of a person who has been through enough of something to know that endings don't arrive with music. They arrive like this: an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, a desk covered with a budget proposal, reading glasses in your hands. "Okay," she said, "just that." Then she put the glasses back on and picked the pen back up, and Tae-jun understood that this was what surviving actually looked like. Not the moment when the threat was finally gone, but the moment after the moment, when the work was still there and you turned back to it and kept going. He went back to his office. 3 weeks later, she came to his doorway with a paper in her hand. "I want to talk about the Director of Executive Operations position," she said. He looked up. "HR has had it posted for 6 weeks. They've interviewed 4 candidates." She set the paper on his desk. Her resume. "I want to be considered." He looked at the resume, then at her. "The conflict of interest," he said. "I've talked to HR. There's a framework for evaluating internal candidates in executive relationships. It requires an independent review panel. I'm asking you to authorize the panel." He looked at her. "You've been doing the job for 4 months already," he said. "I've been doing parts of it, informally, without the title or the compensation." She didn't blink. "I'm asking to do it formally." He picked up the resume. He read it. He already knew everything on it, every competency, every documented achievement, every piece of evidence that the document was designed to present. He knew them because he had watched them happen. He set it down. "I'll authorize the panel today," he said. The review panel took 3 weeks and interviewed 6 candidates. It reached its conclusion without any input from Tae-jun, which was the correct process and which he observed without interference. Nia Calloway was appointed Director of Executive Operations on a bright morning in May. She didn't celebrate it demonstratively. She came in the next morning and sat at her new desk, the corner office that had been reconfigured for the position, and started the day the way she started every day, organized, precise, already several moves ahead of the immediate moment. Tae-jun passed her office at 8:03. She looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Seo," she said, with a quality in it that was not quite formal and not quite personal, and was exactly right for 8:03 on a Tuesday. "Good morning, Ms. Calloway." She went back to her screen. He went to his. The months that followed moved with the particular quality of time that has stopped being about one specific thing and has become instead about the accumulation of ordinary days. The regulatory process continued its measured progress, requiring responses and documentation and occasional appearances that Tae-jun dealt with through Gerber's office with the scrupulous completeness of someone who has committed to a process and intends to honor it. Min-jae stayed. He had restructured his own role. More oversight, less operational, the particular evolution of a man who had been in the field long enough to know when the field work was done. They had a standing Tuesday meeting that sometimes lasted 20 minutes and sometimes lasted 2 hours and never required either of them to explain why. One evening in July, Tae-jun stayed late after the building had cleared. He stood at his office window and looked at the street below. There was no gray sedan. There hadn't been for months. The space across the street where it used to park was just a stretch of pavement, occupied and vacated by the ordinary random vehicles of the ordinary city, none of them waiting for anyone in particular. He stood there for a while. The view was just a view, a city at evening, doing what cities do. Indifferent and large and entirely unmoved by the fact that the man on the 31st floor had spent 10 years building something formidable and was now carefully building something different and could not yet say with certainty which one would prove, in the long accounting, to have been the more significant work. He heard her footsteps in the hall. She appeared in the doorway with her coat on and her bag on her shoulder and the easy bearing of someone who has regained something they were told couldn't be regained. "I was looking for you," she said. "I'm heading out. Wanted to check the Gerber filing deadline. It moved?" "Moved to the 15th. I sent the update this afternoon." "I missed it." She looked at him. "You staying late?" "Few more minutes." She nodded. She looked at the window, at the view, at the street below. "I never look at that intersection anymore," she said. "And then just now I looked at it, and it was just an intersection." He looked at it too. "Yeah," he said. She turned from the window and picked up her bag strap more firmly, the small, decisive movement of someone about to be in motion. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "Good night." She was almost out the door when she stopped. "Tae-jun." He turned. She was looking at him from the doorway with the directness that had always been the truest thing about her. Not the professional surface, not the carefully managed presentation, but the actual woman who had sat in a dark office and cried alone and then gotten up the next morning and kept going because that was what she knew how to do and had always known how to do. "You look different this year," she said, "from when I started. You look," she considered the word, "cleaner, like something got resolved." He looked at her. "Some things got resolved," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved when she was deciding not to say the next thing. "Good night," she said. She left. He listened to her footsteps on the marble, the even, unhurried rhythm of someone who is moving through a building without checking what's behind her, without calculating what might be waiting on the other side of the next door, without any of the constant low-level vigilance that had been the cost of every movement she made for nearly 2 years. Just a person walking. He turned back to his window. The city was doing what it did at evening. Cars and light and the ordinary motion of a few million people going about the particular business of their particular lives, which was mostly invisible to each other and was probably, in ways that couldn't be quantified, the most important thing happening at any given moment. He stood there until the floor went fully dark outside his office, and the street below was just the street, and the only thing left in the room was the quiet of a building that had finished its day. He picked up his coat. He turned off the light. He took the elevator down and came out through the lobby and pushed through the revolving door into the May evening, and the air outside was warm in the specific way of a city in spring. Concrete warmed, complicated, alive with the smell of the river a few blocks over, and the particular energy of a season that has finally arrived. He walked toward the parking structure. There was no message waiting on his secondary phone because the secondary phone no longer served its original purpose and would be decommissioned by the end of the month as part of the operational transition Gerber's process had formalized. There was a message on his regular phone from Nia, sent 2 minutes ago. It said, "Told my mom about the promotion." She cried. Good kind. He stopped on the sidewalk and read it. He typed back, "Tell her congratulations are overdue." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking. Above him, 31 floors up, the executive floor sat in its end-of-day quiet. The lights on their automatic timers, the desks cleared, the building doing the thing buildings do when the people who fill them have gone home. Tae-jun walked through the warm May evening and did not look over his shoulder because there was nothing behind him that required watching, and the road in front of him, though it was long and its specific destination was not yet fully legible, was one he had chosen with clearer eyes than he had chosen anything in a very long time. It was enough. For tonight, and for however many nights followed,